What is up, you sexy scholars? Oh, I am conflicted. You came in hot with this topic like 2 weeks ago, and I'd never really like you said the name, it kind of rung a bell, and then you kind of explained who he was, and I was like, oh yeah, like how have we kind of overlooked this guy? And then you're like, yeah, I've kind of read some stuff about it. Seems like it would be a long one. I was like, yeah, sure. Dude, this guy just I don't even know how to describe him because it depends on what section of his life I'm actually looking at. And it's for someone that stayed, I guess you could say steadfast and singular in his conviction for something, he didn't stray, but I guess it was just kind of the world around him kind of bent into his way of doing things. And you're like, okay, I guess that was what was needed at the time. And then you look into other things later on that he did, and you're just like, huh, that's fishy.
So, for me, this isn't going to be a shock to you guys. This was what seems like an episode where Charles De Gaulle, Charles De Gaulle, if you want to be cool.
Give us the full Charles De Gaulle name treatment.
Charles Andre Joseph Marie De Gaulle.
Can you put some French on that?
Charles Andre Joseph Marie De Gaulle. Yeah. He's a guy who I've heard references of. I mean, he's in a Seinfeld episode where George and Elaine are talking and she brings up how handsome De Gaulle was or something like that. There's other little sprinklings, but we have hit World War II so hard, and I don't think I've ever made a connection with this guy in World War II.
It's because it was like there was so much other stuff going on. As soon as France got taken out, France was kind of, other than the term like occupied France and the liberation of France, you're just kind of like, I guess not a lot is going on in France, but there fucking was.
Yeah, this dude fought World War II, France v. France. He's like, the Germans came in and wrecked this for us, so I want to get back at them.
It was like a three-way. It was a triangle match is what they call that. It was Germany.
Triple threat.
It was France on France with a little bit of German spice in there.
And then there was a little bit of contact with the Italians when they were down in North Africa.
Hey.
But I never understood quite how France seemed to just kind of give up and roll over. And we've talked about the Vichy government a lot. We'll talk about them a lot during this episode. But the thing that stood out to me when I heard it, I don't remember. I think it was a documentary that I heard it in. France was the only country to sign an armistice with Germany.
Mm-hmm. Or part of, well, I guess, yeah, because Vichy wasn't really established until after. And that was kind of the section that France was just like, okay, you guys take the southern half of it. We're still going to watch you guys, but we don't want to have to run the full fucking country. And really the only section we need is in the north because that's where Britain is and everything. Italy's got it down. Well, Italy didn't have it down there, but yeah, it makes sense. You guys run France and just don't do anything to piss us off.
Yeah, but technically at that point in time, the Vichy government was the official government of the country of France.
It's the one the United States was talking to and had recognized was the established government of France, even though they were collaborating with the fucking Nazis.
So every other country was invaded and then just occupied. Whereas France signs this armistice to where the French government technically was... The Vichy government was full-blown in bed with the Germans pretty quickly. But it makes you think, like, why in the world would the French do that? But it turns out it wasn't really the French that did it. Instead of the Germans occupying a place and installing a puppet government, they just ran into a bunch of people that they could run like puppets that were French.
Yeah.
And that's all it really was.
Send any of their people in.
Yeah. And then you have what is known as Free France, which basically for the first little while was just Charles de Gaulle sitting in Great Britain trying to garner support. And you have a guy who is kind of such a prick that Churchill was like, hey man, if you want to get on the radio and start trying to invite some people over here to be a Free France patron.
He was basically like, hey, if you want to get on the radio and just be like a thorn in Hitler's ass, by all means, have at it. Keep getting people to harass the fuck out of the Nazis down in France.
In the beginning, it was Churchill being like, see if you can invite some governmental figures over here that we can deal with.
I feel like before we go any further, because we're already deep into De Gaulle's life at that point, we got to find out how this man essentially came to be who he was.
I told you, dude, this is stinkbait. World War II for him is stinkbait because it's so interesting, but the rest of his life is just as interesting. It's just because World War II is just that.
That was his coming out.
Yeah, and it's just that dangling
That was him
carrot.
on American Idol. Remember, guys, rate, review, subscribe, follow us on our social medias. 5 stars, please, and thank you. And without waiting,
I need a minute.
Okay,
I got a confession to make.
confess.
I don't think this is like a 1-to-1 thing with coming out of the closet, but we're gonna see how it goes. I think it was last week. I don't remember what we recorded when I said it. I shouldn't have spoken for Chris when I said it. We were talking just kind of offhand, and I said that we weren't exactly history guys. I sort of found out that I am a history guy this week doing this episode. In school, at high school, college, anything like that, it was all just a means to an end. I really didn't care about a whole lot of it.
You're just studying to pass the test.
Yeah, the grades that I did well in were just stuff that I was naturally attracted to, like government, history, and all that kind of stuff. Never really saw myself as that kind of a guy. I thought you're just kind of a sports guy, you're a basic guy, you're not an intellectual. That's just how it works. You have that one kind of sports guy in you. And then this week when I was doing research, it was like midnight. I had literally just finished up a documentary that I read the subtitles on because it was in French. And then as I was scrolling through, there was a lecture by like a Yale professor from like 16 years ago on Charles De Gaulle. And I got excited. And then I realized that there's more than just the sports guy in me. Like there's multiple guys in me, which I guess that sort of sounds like coming out of the closet. There was multiple guys inside me.
I think this is one of those situations, if I do have to compare it to something, and I'm going to go back to this, I think it's like, when someone eventually does come out and everyone is like, oh yeah, man, we knew and everything. We were just kind of waiting for you to figure it out. This is exactly what this is. Buddy, we've been doing this for like 2.5 years, going on like almost 3 years at this point. Listen, 5 episodes in, you may not have been a traditional history, like fucking swords and shields and sandals, that kind of stuff, but
not at all.
You've been into fucking court cases and secret societies and all of that kind of stuff. That's historical shit. And that's why I think this show works as well as it does, is because you have a different view of historical things. And then I don't just get fucking trapped in like war and like ancient fucking like civilizations and all that kind of shit. So it's not surprising to me. You are a history guy, and are you ready to get into it?
Yeah, let's jump in.
All right. Without further ado, Charles de Gaulle. The man that would be De Gaulle. Born November 22nd, 1890. Always crazy when we talk about people that were born in the 1800s and then also lived all the way to 1970. So this guy had a...
This guy saw disco fever and was born in the 1800s.
This guy had, without any, shred of sarcasm here, a full life. Born in Lille, France, which was in northern France near the Belgian border, to Henri de Gaulle.
No.
What?
Henri.
Oh, sorry, Henri. Oh,
you got me the first time with
Henri?
Francifying things.
Okay.
You guys are in for a treat, because we usually just butcher names. What you don't know is that Chris and I are secretly fluent in French, and we're going to nail these names every single time. And if it doesn't sound right, you're wrong.
I think that wheels have already fallen off that during the intro. So Henri was a professor of history and literature. And around the house, he did encourage the kids to participate in historical and philosophical debates. So it sounds like a real fun household. Like, what are you kids doing? Are you like playing with toys? Put those things down. I want you to talk about Socrates, and I want you to talk about like great wars, and tell me your opinions. Debate each other on Napoleon, and go.
Really? That's what you thought? I immediately thought Wright brothers. Like, these dudes were they had very smart parents, and I think De Gaulle's parents were extremely smart, but I think they were kind of fun. Like, they let them do a little bit of free thinking. They're studying literature. If you're letting your kids start looking at philosophy, philosophical people usually tend to be a little less strict.
You said fun, and I don't think Charles de Gaulle was a man of fun.
Not so much, but I think he derives pleasure and fun out of different things, because you got to think 1890, 1900, there's not a whole lot of entertainment.
Sticking the wheel and the stick, and kicking the can down the street.
Henri was I guess you would call him a veteran, because he did volunteer to fight in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. This is a guy who loved the history of France so much, as a history professor would, and as a history guy would apparently, that he would just regale the family with old French greatness stories. And at this point, you have some pretty great stories because you lived through Napoleon. Like, there's a certain cachet about France that sort of changes everything. And something that blew my mind that I found out studying in the first little bit of this audiobook that's 36 hours, and I'm probably not going to get through all 36 hours of it. Do you know what the ancient name for France was?
No.
Gaul. Gaul.
Oh, yes, that's where you would get like in Roman times, like the gladiators, Gauls and everything. Yeah, they would be. Yeah, I guess that's the same reason, like Germanic peoples or Gaelic peoples and everything. Okay, makes sense.
Charles the France.
Okay, that makes sense. Oh, that's on the nose.
Got a little bit of heat to it too. They were a pretty well-to-do family. When you're talking about a history professor and somebody who's in literature, Jean, his wife, came from a very wealthy family as well. Another little tidbit about him growing up and his history: both of his grandmothers were sisters.
Okay.
I don't know how they rolled in France. I don't know if there weren't that many people back then.
That uncommon, like trying to make a package deal and everything.
But yeah, the tree kind of grows back into itself eventually in a situation like that. But maybe you're enough generations removed, it's okay. I'm not a scientist. I don't know.
I'm trying to work this out in my head. Keep going. I'm going to try to work out this. Okay, so both of his grandmas, so they were sisters. Mm-hmm. Then they had kids. Then those kids, because if his grandmas were sisters, they had children. Those children then got together. That's full-on cousins, right? That's like not even like second cousins. That's full-on cousins.
So when I heard it in the audiobook, I dove into it pretty deep on Google to try to put it together, and it said that his parents weren't cousins, but his grandparents were, or his grandmas were sisters. I don't know how that works. It seems like that would have to make sense. I guess maybe if they...
I mean, biologically, like, the thing goes in, it works, but like, from a genetic standpoint, there's going to be some side effects probably.
Yeah, I don't think it played too much into young Charles' mind. That was just a fun bit of maybe incestuous tidbits that I always enjoy in these older episodes.
Ancestry tidbits.
Ancestry.com. Mm-hmm. You find out who fucked each other that was family.
That's the one thing that probably comes back for people, and they're just like, oh. Fuck. This isn't what I was hoping for. Just give me a percentage of what I am.
Yeah. But when you have a wealthy family and a family of means and a learned, educated family in 1890, I bet you're probably a few steps ahead of everybody else, right?
You're like in the 95th percent for, yeah.
And so you have these opportunities living in Lille. I don't know where it is. It sounds stupendous.
Northern France. Yeah.
It sounds beautiful, though. Yeah. It sounds like a place that you really like to hang out and chill for a while. But his father, Henri, had this belief that he was a monarchist in feeling and a republican in thought. Now, that's kind of a wild thing to have, because you feel like you really love the monarchy and love having royal rule.
Like a singular figurehead.
Yeah.
Okay.
All of your thoughts go towards republicanism and having representatives that were pushed in by their people.
That seems like quite a contradiction.
And it's like just feelings and thoughts. And honestly, that sounds like a pretty big encapsulation of what De Gaulle was, because he would do things, and then immediately after that, he would do the last thing that you would expect him to do. Like he was kind of a walking juxtaposition. But he loved French history. He loved the philosophy, and that started to shape his mind. His father would tell him stories about French excellence. They would tell stories about the victories that happened during the Franco-Prussian War.
So this is like French nationalism.
A lot of it. And I gotta say, we had a listener reach out and he asked a question about if there is a good nationalism. I think this dude is the only good nationalist that I've ever heard of. And even to the point where like he's an annoying nationalist. Just in his communications with the US and with
this is
Great
like
Britain.
this is like the epitome of like, so, you know, just don't take your nationalism past this point.
Yeah, keep it within your borders. You can be a dick on the national stage. That does nothing bad for us. It just makes you look dumb.
Don't be a dick to others. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. But it kind of gave this young mind belief in these possibilities at a young age. He loved military strategy. He was a huge fan of Napoleon's military strategy. Didn't like the guy. Thought that the guy was actually a bad thing for France. But also you juxtapose that with his love of poetry. Like, he loved battlefield stuff. He loved looking at war and military strategy. And then he also wrote poetry.
I think some people have a way of romanticizing that because, like, if you're looking at stuff written, you know, after any wars, people will talk about, like, you know, not all of the literature is going to be like that, but some of it's pretty flowery stuff, like the way they have to describe things and their word choices.
And you can be flowery to describe war and kind of take the sting out of it, but at the same time, if your mind lets you go there, you can see how brutal it is.
Also, just so we can skip over it, mother was, is it Jeanne?
Jean, I think.
Jeanne de Gaulle. So she was just from a wealthy family. She was
talked
obviously...
about it? Oh, that was what we forgot. All of his grandparents and like great-grandparents were all a part of parliamentary through Normandy and Burgundy.
Okay.
So he kind of comes from this family tree that has some political pull and influence, even though his dad took a completely different route and just was a professor.
So it's not foreign to him.
No, I think he had some idea of, you know, how to act in the government.
Like that,
yes.
Just picking up on conversations, probably.
Absolutely.
So kind of with his interest in military strategy, for his education, he ends up going to a school in Paris, then briefly in Belgium. This was not uncommon at the time for like people that had means to basically like send their kids away to school or to different schools to try to kind of get them abroad, have them gain experience, get them out of the fucking house probably at a certain point. And at age 15, he writes this story about him leading France to victory over Germany in the year 1930. And this was basically like kind of in, I guess it would be in revenge for the Franco-Prussian War in 1890 that didn't go the way that the French wanted it to go. And in his mind, it was like he was avenging French defeat that had occurred. Didn't really focus on his schooling until he got to his mid-teens, when he was basically incentivized to do so by trying to get into like the military academy at Saint-Cyr. And Saint-Cyr, we were kind of kicking it back and forth. Had we mentioned that before? But it's still an established, I think, French. Is it still an established French school?
I don't know if it's still around, but
it was around for a
graduates.
while, and it was a very prestigious school. So, he ends up in. Do you have anything before he ends up getting in and winning a place in Saint-Cyr?
The only real things beyond that, I think part of his ability to travel abroad, not just that they were wealthy, but his dad was a teacher at the school. That's what brought them into Paris, was his father went to teach at this Jesuit college.
Okay.
And that's sort of the other thing that it feels like it falls off, is these people, as you mentioned before, were like brutally Catholic. They were very, very religious people. And back then, it wouldn't be until like the early aughts, I think, that there was really a separation between church and state, where the state just had to be like, we're pulling our hands from these matters. We're officially neutral. Excuse me. And that almost feels like you're walking away from this idea of a monarchy, because a king is obviously going to have his religion and he's going to push it on his subjects.
Yeah, you don't stay a king, especially in that, that time frame. You don't really stay a king for long unless you have support of the church.
A secular king sounds like a pretty wild idea. And so as these two things are kind of growing apart, it kind of starts to change France a little bit, and you see the rise of more of these parties that are coming into power. There's going to be more of a liberal party. France, shockingly enough, throughout this whole entire thing, I've never really thought of France's like political system, but it sounds like they've always been fairly conservative. But you have, in the early aughts of the 1900s, different ideas that are coming into France as to how to rule and how to govern. And it kind of changes, I guess, the way that France, it's not under just like one power anymore. There's starting to be more of a power struggle in a place that's already had a revolution. So
yeah, I mean, France, like you said, it goes through this type of it feels like the government and the system of government is always kind of in flux for like this entire time. Like nothing's ever really set in stone, or something's set in stone and then someone comes along and smashes it and then creates something new.
I think it's still that way today. I think there's still kind of a political wild card at any point in time. And so him wanting to kind of move away from his father being a professor and all of the different things, he still holds on to that history thing. He's still obsessed with military history. And to get into Saint-Cyr would be a pretty big deal, and it pushes him kind of further away from what I think his family's dream was for him, to kind of follow in his dad's footsteps, into almost a completely different role in the military. And I wonder if his dad was like, shit, I probably shouldn't have told him about my time fighting for the country, huh?
No, I think this was one of those things that regardless what kind of position in life that you were after, if you had military service, you were looked upon with a certain reverence.
Okay.
And so I think that was maybe kind of like, I don't want to say like a finishing school, but I kind of feel like at least serving a little bit of time in the military to, say you wore the uniform, you serve the country, especially if you have any type of like political aspirations, you probably need to kind of have that feather in your cap. So I think it was more so along the fact that if he was going to go, he needed to go to a prestigious place like Saint-Cyr. And then maybe they just didn't expect it to become like a career thing. Maybe they thought he was going to go in for a little bit. This was also at a time when, he doesn't get into Saint-Cyr until 1909. He's 19 years old. It's also at a time when like the reputation for the army was at like an all-time low.
Yeah.
Recruitment for this Saint-Cyr place was usually like 2,000 applicants a year, and it was down to like 800 a year. So it's kind of at a lull, and he ends up, getting in there, and his class rank, I mean, he doesn't come in like a fucking, swinging or anything like that. He ends up being ranked 119 out of 221.
Well, before he can really get his feet wet, there was a law that was passed earlier that said any like future army officers would have to attend at least 1 year of mandatory service. I guess voluntary service.
Yeah. So he wins a place basically, but the condition is that aspiring officers, they're required to serve 1 year in the ranks. Basically, you have to spend time as a private and an NCO, so a non-commissioned officer, before attending this academy.
Glad you explained what NCO was. I had no idea what that meant.
Yeah.
What is a commissioned officer? Somebody that's asked to be an officer?
That's okay. So I'm probably going to butcher this. I'm sorry if I do. I believe an NCO is someone that didn't attend any type of military school, but was able to be promoted into that rank.
Gotcha.
For like being promoted into an officer role. And I believe officers essentially were guys that had come out of military school like as officers. They weren't like privates or anything like that. Like they came out, they received specialized like training and education for it.
So if you went to Army or Navy or Air Force or anything like that, and then graduated and moved on as an officer, then you're a commissioned officer?
I believe so.
Okay.
That's how I kind of understand it.
Well, yeah. he seems to do pretty well. There was something like he needed a full year, but instead he signed up for 4.
Mm-hmm.
And then he did his time and he moved back to Saint-Cyr. And it seemed like he got it the second time around. He was kind of a rowdy, rebellious dick, but he improved his rank pretty well, didn't he?
Well, the first go around, so he spent time as a private NCO. He was denied a sergeant promotion, and kind of the reasoning from his superior officer was that he felt that De Gaulle felt that nothing less than constable would be good enough for him. And so I think it was kind of a thing to maybe teach him some humility, because that's going to be a common theme throughout his entire life, is his extreme like confidence in himself, to the point where you're just like, where they say there's a difference between cocky and confident. If there was a level above cocky, it would be De Gaulle. So you can just use that as the phrase, like this guy's a De Gaulle.
Well, he's a level above cocky because he was head and shoulders above everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, he's okay. So at a time when the average was, I think, 5'5", 5'5", this guy is 6'5".
Yeah.
So he's a foot taller, literally, a head above, like you said, literally a head above the average of the population of France.
Well, the French being is, spoiler alert, I give the French a lot of shit. I don't know. I think this might have got them some points back in my eyes, but all-time bad nickname givers. What was his nickname?
The Great Asparagus.
Come on. Because he was so tall and so lanky and he had a big nose, you win asparagus? You couldn't...
Like, what's tall?
You couldn't go, Beaker from the Muppets? Maybe the Muppets weren't a thing yet?
Not even close. I think Jim Henson was a few decades.
Okay. All right. So maybe Beaker's
before.
Off the board.
You might be actually closer to like a century before.
But asparagus feels like a stretch for like a good nickname.
Maybe no one liked asparagus.
Okay. That actually, like, less of a physical traits look and more of just nobody likes asparagus and it makes your pee stink.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. All right. Rescinded. France, you get the point back.
So by the end of year 1, he ends up being ranked 45th. So coming, I guess, out of his service and everything like that, I'm guessing there had to be some type of like entry type thing where they were also ranking them. He goes from 109th at the beginning to 45th by the end of year 1.
Out of like 220, something like
221, I think.
That's not bad.
And he's praised for his conduct, his intelligence, his character, his spirit. And that was a huge thing, apparently, was this thing that they considered spirit, the French spirit. And he was resistant to fatigue. So, I mean, if you're talking about physical traits, they're like, we can't fucking tire this lanky, tall-ass motherfucker out.
Also, though, he was the source of everyone else's fatigue.
Yes. This guy, if I have to relate him to a modern character, I feel like he is, do you ever watch What We Do in the Shadows?
I've seen a couple episodes. I've seen, I think, most of the
dude
first
that's
season.
The energy vampire.
Yeah.
I forgot what his name is in that, but yeah, that's kind of how I feel like being in the room with Charles de Gaulle would be. Is just like,
we get it, man. We understand. We can talk about something else. Yeah, he always kind of seemed like his impression of himself was greater than everybody else, which, I mean, he makes it work. And that's the maddening thing, is it's like he can back it up to a certain extent to where it's not really undeniable, because he's still a prick, but at the same time, he's a useful prick.
Well,
go ahead.
I was going to say, he ends up crawling himself up to 13th in his class by the time he graduates in 1912. So at this point, after graduating the military academy, he's able to go and basically kind of like serve on a more permanent basis in an officer's role with like a unit or like with a division or however they want to break that up.
Second lieutenant.
And I guess you had the option essentially of going abroad to one of the French colonies or things like that. North Africa being like a huge one. French Indochina, I believe. French Polynesia, French
Vietnam, basically.
Yeah, a lot of shit over in the by Australia and Japan and China and Asia and everything like that. He decides instead, he's like, no, I'm going to stay close to home, and serves with the 33rd Infantry Regiment.
Which was what he enlisted with initially.
Oh, yeah, so he went back, essentially went back to them. It was commanded by this guy named Philippe Pétain. And this guy is going to be basically de Gaulle's mentor for the early stages of his life and his military career. And then at a certain point, they're going to part ways, and then they're going to end up meeting back up again under different circumstances. It's kind of crazy how they just stay within each other's kind of spheres.
Well, the 33rd was like a highly decorated, very famous regiment.
Yeah, it was like a special, like not special forces, but it was like a kind of more of an elite.
They'd been in a lot of battles, and
Yeah.
they had been fairly successful. Maybe most decorated might be a better term for it.
And I mean, Pétain, like to his credit and everything, De Gaulle had written about him that his first colonel had taught him the art of command. So he held this guy definitely in reverence. And basically for the next, like I said, 15 years, I think it was, he ends up kind of following Pétain. There was this, this was at a time where also kind of right before World War One. And again, World War One, if you haven't listened to the episode, go back and listen to it. There's, there's tensions in Europe, but it gets kicked off very, very quickly when Franz Ferdinand gets assassinated. That's like just basically they were wanting to go to war. They were waiting for something to happen, and they used this as the excuse. Well, one of the kind of, I want to say, like doctrines, I guess, of the French military was this thing called the offensive spirit. And they had a belief that the actual spirit of the fighting man would give them an advantage and the advantage to actually win in these battles. So like literally the guys that are like willing to go out and charge out of like the trenches and all that kind of stuff, just by overwhelming spirit, that they would conquer the enemy and overrun the enemy.
Cavalry, you're on horses. That's becomes kind of an issue when you're on a horse and somebody's firing heavy artillery your way.
Yeah, cannons and horses don't seem to mesh very well.
No.
So 1913 rolls around. He's promoted to first lieutenant, and that was in October. And it doesn't take long before, essentially a little under a year, until he's actually kind of thrown into the grinder when the Great War kicks off in August of 1914.
To your energy vampire point, I think he was kind of the same idea vampire, because Pétain had this belief, like you were talking about, that these traditional war tactics were kind of outdated in this time of heavy firepower. And De Gaulle was still a fan of kind of the Napoleonic strategy of lining up in columns and attacking in more of an
orderly fashion.
Yeah, I was going to say logical, but orderly I think is a better term, over this kind of firepower strategy that Pétain has. But on the heels and kind of there after World War One, it's almost like he saw what Pétain was talking about. Maybe he got to experience it firsthand. And so since maybe he finally had like what Pétain had on the battlefield and seeing how it worked, it was like his first introduction to be like, oh, yeah, this
we shouldn't line up. Yeah, we should not fucking be lining up and just marching at these guys. That is...
You watch a cannonball take out 6 guys that are all charging. It's like,
you wouldn't even see it. An artillery shell would just land and I just saw like a group of 5 guys get vaporized and I didn't even see it coming. I heard a whistle and then they were just gone. So the 33rd is sent to basically stop the German advances in Belgium. So this is where, because it's northern France, that area, this is where we are getting into like the deep, deep part of like trench warfare. This is when trench warfare, or where trench warfare was the most prevalent. So he's with this guy. He's with Pétain. Pétain's still his commanding officer. And the 5th Army, which I guess the 33rd was serving under, was led by a guy named General Charles Lenrezac. And basically, this guy had that kind of belief in those 19th century tactics where they were doing these, the whistle gets blown, they're coming out of the foxhole and they're charging into artillery. And it doesn't take long, like you said, for De Gaulle to see this and just being like, yep, this doesn't work, and kind of pivots his way of thinking. And also in, I think it was maybe a little bit later into World War One, this is where you kind of see like the advent of tanks coming in, of like armor coming in. And it was most of the time the tanks were used for like crossing no man's land as like basically like, shields that they could cross. They did have guns on them, but it wasn't like later in World War II where like tanks were sent out as like mobile artillery. These things were just supposed to kind of push the ball a few more yards down and kind of try to take no man's land.
You go straight till it runs out of gas or breaks down, and then you just run up behind it and take all that land.
Yep, exactly. So on the 15th of August, he's actually wounded in the knee.
Doesn't take long.
No.
They get there in the beginning of August. By the 15th, he gets his first bullet hole.
Well, the fucking fighting had to... Well, here's the thing, too. Although he is an officer, he's also having to kind of get up, and he's the guy getting up in his, like, chargeman, and then he might be a little bit behind him. Still a lot of fucking shells or a lot of bullets flying down.
I don't think he would have wanted it any other way.
Well, I mean, I'm sure he would like to not get shot in the knee.
But only because it took him off the battlefield and out of the fight. Like, he wasn't mad that he got shot and had like PTSD. He was mad that he got shot so he couldn't go out and try to kill more people.
Yeah, so this was at the Battle of Dinant. And basically this happens in August, and he's back to the unit in October. So you can't really fault this guy for not being dedicated and trying to get back in on this.
But his dedication came at a price, because as he was laying in the hospital, he was talking to other soldiers about like what happened to them and how they ended up there, and gets this general disappointment in like how bad the French generals are leading them, and about how the English troops that they're supposed to be teaming up with aren't really on the same page. And there's always going to be, regardless of how far away you get from it, the English and French have had such a checkered past that if one of them doesn't support the other one, it's an immediate issue, and it gets thrown back to everything else.
Well, it's this. They're fighting each other until there's someone else to fight.
Yeah.
And then they're like, you know what? You don't fuck. We're the only ones that can fuck with France. So since you're fucking with France, now we have to team up with France and then beat you before me and France can go back to trying to fight each other. Yeah,
eventually at this point, it was just kind of diplomatic shots that they would fire at each other, but there's still a long history of double cross.
And you have a wonder, and you're like, yeah, why do you think your guys' armies like aren't on the same page and aren't like, cooperating as well as you should? Because your guys are used to fucking fighting each other, and it's kind of weird for them to be, in close proximity and listening to orders or trying to help you guys out. There's probably some bad blood there, just a little bit.
Most of the battle stories that these guys grew up with learning in school were against the other ones.
Your dad probably killed someone else's dad and vice versa.
There's a chance.
So, I mean, and on the battlefield, this guy kind of was fearless. He would crawl into no man's land and crawl all the way across. And in some of these areas, no man's land was pretty small. Other places, it was very large. And he would crawl up to these enemy trenches and basically try to listen for like their plans, their troop movements, try to figure out how many guys they had there, and then crawl back while it was still dark and try not to get fucking blown up or shot at. And kind of due to this, in 1915, he's awarded the Croix de Guerre, which is, it's not like the Medal of Honor, but it's like recognition of, I think, like valor and things like that, bravery. And he's promoted to captain. So we're in the second year of the Great War, World War I, and we come to March 10th, which is the first Battle of Champagne. And again, what usually happens to when you're in war, he gets shot in the left hand. And he's like, you know what? This isn't that bad. I'll go back. I'll get this thing, taped up and everything, and then I'll be back to business. Well, it gets infected, and because of the infection, he's out for 4 months. So shot in the hand knocks him out for 4 months, where being shot in the knee only knocks him out for like 2. And so this had to even piss him off even more that like this infection is the thing keeping him down.
Yeah, and he just, I don't remember if it's now or coming up, but I believe it might be when it's coming up, so this will be a little spoiler on it, but he's writing letters home to his family talking about how disappointed he is that he's not back out on the battlefield fighting. Like, most of these dudes, I don't know what the protocol was. I'm assuming if you got shot and it was bad enough, they probably sent you home. It was probably more of his choice to go back out onto the battlefield. each time?
I think it depended how badly. Like, I think it was more of a like, okay, you can't be effective in fighting, or you can still fire a gun. Like, we're gonna keep you till you can get back out there. Versus like, oh, like you got half your toes blown off, you're not gonna be able to walk. So yeah, get out of here. Go serve in a support role back home or something.
Probably depended on how hot things were too, right? Mm-hmm. Like if there was a need for you to go back out there, you're probably going to go back out there. But I think every single time he just wanted to go back out there. And it's like every single time he comes back, they realize that he's back and they're like, okay, well, we'll just give you this now. Like, we'll give you command of the 10th Company upon your return from this infection that you get.
Well, I mean, and it's not like he's not being successful in some of these roles. He's just simply getting wounded.
That's just, it's a cause of war that you're eventually something's going to happen to you.
So we get to 1916, March 2nd, the Battle of Verdun. And the Battle of Verdun, that's definitely getting its own episode because it's bonkers, but it took place over a pretty wide area of land. So it's not just, the main fighting, or it might have been closest to Verdun, but it took place over several cities and like little towns and villages and things. So he is actually captured during this battle. And what ends up happening is I guess him and his like unit or his men get surrounded. He's trying to lead a breakout to basically punch a hole to get his men out and back to friendly lines. He gets basically shell shocked by like artillery that goes off next to him. So he's fucking dazed and he's stunned, gets fucking bayoneted in the fucking left thigh. Now, I have a question for you. Do you consider it being bayoneted? Do you have to, get stabbed? I'm talking like thrusted with the bayonet, or can you just get slashed with it and both are being bayoneted? Because what do you think of when you hear someone got bayoneted?
I think of the stab, just the straight in and straight out. But
you had to be slashing a little bit too, right? You're swinging that thing just trying to like draw blood, trying to kill that guy.
Well, and there's a nasty, I don't know where bayonet technology was at this point in time, like if it was just like a rudimentary knife that they put on the front of them.
Oh, buddy, I think this was at the time when they figured out
triangular.
They had to do the triangular bayonet. The bayonets in World War II were just basically the GI knives that they would give them and they could put on the end of it. Because they didn't really have bayonets on them all the time because it would throw off your firing because of the extra weight. So you would only do it when you were going to actually do like a charge, or you ran out of ammo and you were trying to use that as a weapon.
So that's interesting because it's almost like bayonet technology devolved then.
Yeah.
And maybe they outlawed the tri-points because a tri-point bayonet's nasty. If you get stabbed with that, that's not just an easy stitch job. That's a very difficult job to clean up.
It's supposed to make it to where you can't do it. I think it came down to the point where most of the fighting was done with the rifles to where they had to be accurate. So you're not going to put a permanent bayonet on there, which means you're not going to do the triangular one. There was also probably some talk about after World War I. It's like, chill with the fucking triangular bayonets. It's doing,
war crime. Rules of engagement.
Yeah, exactly. I also think it's the fact that everything had to serve a dual role. So they're not going to give a guy a bayonet that can only serve as a bayonet. They're going to give him a knife that he can use for other stuff that can also then serve as a bayonet.
That makes more sense.
So anyways, ends up getting bayoneted, but that doesn't take him out either. He's actually captured after passing out from the poison gas that was in the area. So this guy kind of gets run through the ringer right in this last little battle where he's fucking dazed, stabbed, and now gassed. And ends up spending the next 32 months, which is 2.5 years, a little over 2.5, right? 24 months would be 2 years. Another
2 years, 8
30
months
would be 2.5. So yeah, 2 years, 8 months in 6 different POW camps.
Well, do you consider yourself lucky from waking up from the poison gas at that point? Because you know that killed a lot of people in that gas attack.
Initially, yes. But then once you figure out that you're going to be a POW for the next 2 years, 8 months, I think you're probably at some point being like, fuck, I wish that gas would have got me.
Well, you just wake up and everybody around you speaking German, and you're like, fuck, this sucks.
Now,
didn't break his resolve, did it?
Well, lucky he could actually read German. I don't know if he could speak it, but I know he could read it because of school and also because they would vacation like during the summers in Germany. So he actually learned how to read it. So he was able to read the newspapers, keep up to date on stuff. They said that the POW camps he was sent to because he was an officer, kind of like the comparison about the bomber episode where the officers and pilots got to be like treated better. He was treated decently. I think what he would write back in his letters that he was being treated decently. So this wasn't like a work camp or anything. And at the camp, because he was basically kind of like an early politician. at these camps because he was going around and he was talking to all these guys about what he had seen. What he had seen was when he was in the hospital, his gripes, his concerns. The way we're doing stuff isn't working out anymore. They don't know how to fight this war, to the point when they started calling him the Constable. That was his nickname at the camp.
Or Constable Asparagus.
Mm-hmm. Well,
why did he get shuffled around so much, though? Because 6 camps seems like a lot of different transitions.
It does. And I mean, one of the things that could possibly lead to him getting shuffled around like this was the 5 escape attempts that he did. Now, it's also impressive that he got up to 5 attempts without them killing him. So there was a lot of restraint here from the Germans to not kill him after this. Now, he was put in solitary a lot of the time. He was had privileges and like food and shit like that taken away. But he attempted to escape in a laundry basket.
Chapo. I thought that we'd switch back to Chapo Guzman because every one of these sounds very similar.
There's tropes. There's escape tropes. There's only so many ways you can try to escape someplace. It's going to be laundry basket. It's going to be a tunnel underground. It's going to try to be digging through a wall. It's also going to be trying to dress up as a nurse.
A 6'5" nurse.
When you're fucking 6'5". I'm guessing the height of Germany wasn't really up to that, wasn't average. So he probably, and also you're at the camp. You already stand out. You're one of maybe 2-3 guys that are 6'5". And so when they see and they're like, do we have any 6'5" nurses here? And they're like, fuck no.
Why is that nurse's skirt so short? Is there a dick popping out of the bottom of that?
I'm confident there were also men that were serving as nurses because...
Oh, shit. Oops.
No. What I'm saying, though, is I love that your head went instantly to that fact because when you do think of war and nurses, you always see them as women. You see the corpsmen and everything out on the lines and the surgeons as men. But in my head, I also was like, yeah, I mean, he's a dude, obviously a 6 foot. There's no 6'5" women that are nurses. Like, what does he have the mask over his face and it's just sticking out because of his huge nose? But yeah, so obviously none of these escape attempts worked.
Damn.
And yeah, deep depression because he wasn't fighting. And when the armistice was actually signed on November 11th in 1918, didn't take him long because he was able to return home by December 1st.
And what's the incredible fact that we talked about last night?
We talked about a lot of incredible facts last night.
All 4.
Oh, yeah, shit.
All 4 of the De Gaulle young men. He had 3 brothers, 1 sister. All 4 De Gaulle brothers that served time in World War I came home alive.
I did point out the fact that they were all well-to-do.
Yeah.
They were probably officers, which officers had a much higher survival rate. Like when we hear stories like during the Civil War, World War II for the United States about like the brothers that were serving.
Yeah.
That was like brothers that went in and enlisted and were like privates and like maybe sergeants, guys fighting on the front line. Whereas if you came into this position, maybe you also had like some admin roles or you were maybe serving like underneath another superior officer where you were like kind of his assistant and things like that, to where you weren't in the type of danger that the common fighting guy would have been in. But still, what's the number of French that died? That's why this is so impressive.
1.2 million or 1.7?
So so it was 1.3 total Frenchmen died fighting in World War I.
Okay.
And I want to say that was what died. 1.3 is what died. 1.7 is the amount that were taken prisoner.
And it was...
Oh, sorry. That was during the fall of France. The 1.7 was during the fall of France.
Okay, that was the fall of France.
The 1.3 was the amount of Frenchmen that died fighting in World War I.
About 10% of the male population in France.
They said it was actually 25% in World War I.
Oh.
The 1.7 in World War II. This is when the facts all mix up.
Yeah.
The ones that were prisoners were 10% of the male population.
Well, this kind of hit me different too, because when we talked about the Mussolini episode, Mussolini was looking at France and he's like, well, they're an old dying nation because their birth rates are so much lower. This is why their birth rates were lower, because they lost 25% of the breeding stock to try to resupply this country.
Yep. And so that led to a 2-generation downturn in their population because, first of all, you have the guys that are 18 up to, I don't even know if it was as old as 18. You probably had ones that were younger. you had those guys that were that core fighting, because your officers are usually going to be older, more established, like serving in the military at the time, but the conscripts are going to be people that are younger coming in. When you lose that generation, you're not just losing them for that generation. You're losing that generation, but then you're also impacting the next generation, because now you have 25% less men in the breeding stock, essentially.
Oh, yeah. Well, that, and then you also have everybody that's shell-shocked and doesn't want to come back and have children again after war.
War has made me soft.
Yeah.
And I can't get hard, and there's a reason for it. But a huge impact. And so because of this, I mean, you come back to essentially a France that's going to have to really shift its priorities around as far as how it's going to structure its military. And guess who's going to try to make a name for himself, because he has this grand idea for exactly how it should go.
It's the big asparagus. The big asparagus wants those roles. And to a certain extent, he doesn't even really come. He comes back to France, and then in this interwar period, he served in the French Army Division mission to Poland, instructing the Polish soldiers, and he just kind of went in there as, I don't know if he was a sergeant or what he was at that point, but he was an instructor in this Polish war with Russia, but then also sees action.
Russia. Yeah. Communist Russia. So they're already...
New communist Russia, too,
New
at
communist
that point.
Russia. Yeah, so they're already, you would think, hey, let's take care of things in France. They're like, no, we got this other threat, and we need our guys to keep getting war experience, and also the Polish are probably paying us a fuck ton to try to do this and giving us stuff that we need. So I think he was an infantry instructor. He actually achieved the rank of major in the Polish army, so he also served in the Polish army. And he won this thing called the Virtuti Militari, which is a Polish, essentially, war medal.
Not a war medal.
The Polish war medal, is that what it was?
The highest rank, or the highest military award that you can get in Poland. As a Frenchman, he had to have pulled off some pretty incredible stuff, because you're not getting that just because you're an instructor.
Well, apparently he must have, because he ends up coming back as a lecturer at Saint-Cyr. So he's coming back to essentially serve as a lecturer, someone to provide this new upcoming group of, cadets coming through this military academy. And, he serves as kind of a lecturer. He's not a professor. He's not a teacher. He just comes in and lectures every so often about like his theories on like, the military and strategy and things like that.
Mostly just military history, I think.
He ends up attending a staff college. So I guess this is kind of what you had to do if you wanted to kind of progress through the ranks, especially if you were doing so at a time when there wasn't war, so you weren't being promoted through the ranks and shifting positions due to the combat and everything. If you wanted to climb the ranks during peacetime, you had to attend certain additional higher education type stuff. Basically, at this staff college, this is where he gets into the big argument of his belief of tactics based on circumstance versus doctrine. And if you guys have listened to any of like the Japanese Navy episodes or the one on Midway, we talk about the Japanese naval doctrine, how it was so set in stone that they couldn't be flexible like the U.S. Navy was in changing their war tactics. And that's one of the big reasons that it kind of led to their defeat. Well, France has its way of waging war. And the way it is once that's set about troop movements, about how artillery is dispersed, things like that, and you have that set in how you're going to train, and that's how you're going to develop your artillery, and that's how you're going to, position your troops. If you end up going to war, and then all of a sudden the enemy has tactics that counter your tactics, or your tactics can't stop, the doctrine says, hey, just keep doing this shit, because we've determined that over the course of time, it's going to actually work. We have to do this tried and true shit that we think is going to function. Whereas De Gaulle came in, he was like, no, we need to base our tactics on the circumstance of what's going on. We need to be adaptable. We need to be mobile. One of the things, he picked up during World War I, when he wasn't in POW camp, was basically that because of this armor being introduced onto the battlefield, this was actually going to be kind of the next phase of warfare. It was going to have to be armored, and it was going to have to be mobile. And so and he's a student at this staff college, and he's arguing this point with like even like professors and shit. He clashes with instructors. This is where he's classified with his excessive self-confidence. I'm sure it's not the first time somebody has described him like that.
But does this not sound like a little of what Pétain was talking about, that he kind of clashed with the doctrine of moving away from cavalry and traditional things?
Because Pétain was also in a much higher position, which I think that based on his previous military experience, you had this guy coming in that, yes, he fought in World War I. Yeah, he was a POW. He has this experience, but he's still relatively young when you compare him to other people that are also arguing these other, stratagem tactics, things like that.
Well, he's arguing with an instructor. So this dude's had 10 times maybe the career that he's had in the military so far.
One of the instructors that he would clash with a lot described him as having the attitude of a king in exile, which as we get into this, I come back to that and I'm like, fuck, this guy fucking nailed it. And how this guy actually acts and how he expects people to actually treat him.
For as much as it was a weird kind of like at age 15 talking about leading the French army to beat the Germans, technically he's not wrong. Like, it just was a different circumstance, a different time frame, and there were different people pulling the weight, but he wasn't wrong. And this guy kind of calls it the exact same way, because there is a point in time in De Gaulle's life where he sort of feels like a king in exile.
So he enters this staff college ranked 33rd. He ends up leaving ranked 52nd. So he took a little bit of a slide.
52nd still graduates.
Oh yeah, and he also achieves the grade of good enough, which that was his actual, like that was the ranking system. Like I think it was good enough. I'm not sure how it worked.
It's the French, man. Good enough. Good enough's good enough.
Well, here's the thing with good enough is actually not good enough for a lot of advancement in the military, because in 1925, basically he goes and lobbies to Pétain, and he's like, hey, I can't get any of these jobs that I'm wanting to get because I'm good enough, but they want more. So he has his grade raised to good, which is better than good enough, strangely enough. And basically this ends up allowing him to take like a general staff posting where he's able to kind of work within the structure of military command to try to kind of get his foot in the door, learn how that works, and then try to kind of progress his rank from there.
Well, it's weird to hear kind of an occupation story that happens before World War II, but he ends up being stationed down in the Rhineland because the side effect of losing World War I was Germany lost a shitload of land, including the Rhineland, which then becomes very important in World War II because what do they come back for? The Rhineland.
Because that's like also like the breadbasket.
Yeah.
Everything.
And so he's kind of in this area already where I don't know how much like supervision he's doing as far as like, is he working with just the military? Is he out there seeing the people? But I don't think the people in the Rhineland were too out of it at this point. Like, I'm just trying to forecast and kind of go back and play this thing in Hitler's mind where, like, did they really need to get it back? Was occupation that bad? Or was
I think he was sending a message.
Yeah, okay.
I think part of it. And it had been there. If anything, that's where he had the most justification to try to take that back. Because remember, he's like, we're just annexing this back.
Yeah.
We're not going any further than this. So after he ends up getting this general staff posting, he's also serving as what they call a pen officer for Pétain. And basically a pen officer is just a ghostwriter.
Exactly.
So a ghostwriter is someone that basically Pétain is wanting to write a book, and he's using De Gaulle to actually write the book, to kind of do the research. And maybe Pétain is inputting some stuff here and there, but basically he wants De Gaulle to write the book, and then he wants to add like the last chapter onto it to put like his signature on this thing. So there's some argument and some essentially a little bit of friction that comes between that because De Gaulle wanted more credit for this book. So this kind of starts a little bit of the friction. They end up falling out over this book called Les Soldats.
The Soldier's Way?
The Soldier's Way, I think. And yeah, this is the one, sorry, that I was referring to. He wants more credit on it. And
the reason that he wanted more credit was because he wrote the entire thing. and then Pétain wrote the last chapter.
I'm not saying it's an invalid gripe.
Well, this whole thing is sort of, to me, like they're falling out over this literary stuff is De Gaulle has already published books and essays. And like you were talking about, he was publishing essays on this use of tactics according to circumstances. So he almost has more of that literary mind that he might have grown up with more than Pétain did. Mm-hmm. And Pétain might have been a shit writer. So when he gets De Gaulle in there to write this book for him, De Gaulle does basically all the work. Pétain might have scribbled in a short chapter that was just kind of like an aside from everything else. But then Pétain starts being like, well, I paid you to write this.
Maybe that's the way it worked. Maybe that's what Pétain had to do for somebody at a certain point. He thought, I'm not saying it's right.
Well,
I definitely feel like De Gaulle has cause.
And he gets the last laugh.
Eventually, yeah.
Well, not even for that, for the book.
Oh, that's right, because the book ends up not even coming out.
For a while. And then De Gaulle goes ahead, and we're getting ahead of ourselves in this relationship, but just to understand that this happens in the middle of this relationship.
Yeah, so, okay, see if I can get it right. Pétain ends up going with another guy to ghostwrite the book. Mm-hmm. De Gaulle raises a stink about it. Pétain is like, you know what? I'm not going to publish the book. De Gaulle then takes a whole bunch of the shit out of the book that he had wrote, put it into a different book, and published that book.
Basically the same book minus Pétain's little part that he had added and what he had told the other ghostwriter to add, and then calls him up. He's like, hey, you're not going to do anything with that manuscript, right? And he's like, no, why? He's like, okay, well, I'm going to publish it. And he's like, you can't publish it. It's mine. He's like, I changed a few things, but hindsight in a person's life can maybe have them view something differently. It most of the time does. But in I think it was his memoir. I can't remember if it's someone like during an interview. He ends up saying that Pétain died in 1925. Pétain did not die in 1925. No. What he's essentially alluding to is that once he started working for Pétain, that was when Pétain was done. That was when essentially he felt that maybe I don't know if it was like died to him as a mentor and like I can no longer learn anything else from this person. I have surpassed this person, or that he was no longer he was going to have his career surpassed at this point, since allowing De Gaulle essentially kind of in the door with him. Could be a lot of that. I think part of it could be it's like he saw Pétain lose his will that he saw out on the battlefield. Like he's not the same guy that's this ferocious fighter anymore. He's almost more of a statesman because they're not at war anymore. So he sees like the fire come out of him and just the administrator side. And De Gaulle never really loses his fire at any point in time.
No. So we're going to skip ahead, 1927, in September, he actually makes commandant, which is major, and ends up commanding this elite light infantry. And like you said, I think we're up to the point where we're talking about now when that was the occupying force in Trier, which I believe was in occupied, or
a different part outside of the Rhineland, I believe.
Okay. So as the commander of this, there's certain there's certain standards essentially of the French army. Like you train a certain way, you do this, you're not allowed to do this other stuff. They want essentially a uniform, army. So certain things like freezing river crossings, imprisonment of soldiers for requesting transfers to other units, certain things like that are going to kind of probably raise some eyebrows because you're not supposed to be doing that shit. And so he ends up kind of getting called out by some of these like superior officer for this excessive training, making him cross this river. And then the big one is stripping the rights of a soldier because he imprisoned him because he had requested to get fucking out of De Gaulle's unit.
He wanted a transfer, and instead of a transfer, he got put in.
He got a transfer. It was just a transfer into a cell. So while he's in trouble, he basically tries to name drop Pétain and basically like, hold on a second, I can't be in trouble. I'm one of Pétain's guys. And they're like, okay. And they're like, yeah, I think you're still going to be in trouble for this. And he's like, hold on a second, and has to go and then contact and call Pétain. Is like, oh, I fucked up. I need you to make this go away. And so ends up going to him and kind of gets the shit dropped.
Yeah, Pétain smooths it out, it seems like.
Mm-hmm. So despite this, Pétain is still protecting this guy. And I think kind of the general consensus with his instructors and Pétain and the people in the French army and everything is they're like, he's good. Like, could be really good, but he's a fucking dick.
Well, this
So,
is
like,
also pre-book theft, too. So him and Baton are still on at least a little better.
But still, the consensus is that he's a fucking dick.
Yeah.
And they're like, if you don't have to really deal with him, you just need him to run shit and don't have to interact with him at all, and he's not your superior,
Yeah.
he's probably fine. But because he is so good, he's going to be a lot of people's superiors, and he's, you know, an asshole. So it's a little bit problematic, but not problematic enough for us to stop progressing him up the ranks.
A little bit like the prison camps. Like, he's okay. He does fine in his own element, but just maybe send him out of your orbit. Like, he's a good officer, just maybe he doesn't, or he's not a headache that you would want.
Yeah.
And we kind of skipped over this a little bit because I wanted to run it up until 1928 to talk about it. There's sort of a reason why this isn't something that we've mentioned really at all. And it's because he was a fairly private dude. But 1921, hit the Wayback Machine. He ends up marrying Yvonne Verduch. They would go on to have 3 children. He would have Philippe. Don't know if he named him after Pétain. But he was born in 1921. They would have Elizabeth in 1924. And then in 1928, they had his 3rd child, Anne. And I had never really thought about this, but at a point in time, stuff like Down syndrome wasn't really like known.
Mm-hmm.
And something that would typically follow a child being born of Down syndrome is they would be put in an institution because their family wouldn't want to mess with them.
And because people were, you know, there were a lot less people of means that could essentially handle that type of stuff, whereas people that would have those children that were of the lower classes are like, we need everyone working, and like it was almost like they didn't know there weren't fucking services for that. There wasn't even a knowledge of what it was. There was no knowledge of you know, how to, you know, integrate those people into society and everything. And so it was just like, we got to send them away.
Yeah.
And to his credit, De Gaulle was like, nope, fuck this shit. This is my girl. And basically was just like, that was the kid that he doted on. That was his, I really feel like that was, you know, once we get into it, it's going to get even a little dicier with him. But I think if you had to point to something to be like, okay, here's the human element to him, and here's you knew that something other than just like the focused fucking robot.
Yeah.
He had this over here, and this is where his emotion was.
Well, this guy that seems like a wild, pompous ass, like there's stories about him and Anne just like taking walks out into the fields, and you could overhear De Gaulle like asking Anne about things that she knew about. Like he was on her level talking to her. Later on, she unfortunately would die of pneumonia at age 20, so 1948. This is after the war. This is after World War II has happened. He made sure during World War II, we'll talk about this again, but that they were flown over to Great Britain to be protected too, so he wouldn't have to worry about it. When he's going on stage and at these speaking engagements after World War II, they said that he would always bring his family with him and they would be sitting in the back waiting for him. Like, he was a very private guy, and I think Yvonne, like, there was never an interview done with her. So there wasn't a whole lot publicly known about her and the family.
I think he was very traditional in the sense that like she had her role, and he had his. This wasn't a JFK Jackie O situation.
No,
this isn't a Eleanor and Teddy.
Mm-mm.
Or wait, FDR and Eleanor. What? Yeah, FDR and Eleanor. Because remember, Eleanor went down and flew with the Tuskegee.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a. I don't know. I think that this humanizes this guy so much that he was able to understand that while he's in the middle of sort of this revolution that he's leading, like he still loved and cared about his family enough to be there and to support his daughter that honestly, at that point in time, he had the choice not to do.
Yeah. So 1928, I think, rolls around and that's when, like we were talking about, the rift kind of keeps widening between Pétain and Charles. That's when he brought on the new ghostwriter to help him write that book, La Soldette. And then also, apparently, De Gaulle had written a eulogy that Pétain was supposed to read for like some other general or something like that, and Pétain didn't use it. So it's like you have a speechwriter and they write you a speech, and then you get up there and they start talking and it's not the speech that you wrote. They decided to go another direction. So even just like petty little shit like that, I think Pétain didn't see it in the way of being like, no, I'm just using this other speech. I have other people that write speeches for me and everything. And De Gaulle was just kind of like, oh, so you're not going to use my speech. I think there was some of that attitude.
100%.
We're about an hour in.
Okay.
You know what that means? We'll be right back.
Well, hey there, all you sexy historians. How you guys doing?
It is time for
Socials.
Where can they find us on Instagram?
If they want to follow us, they can find us at Historically High Pod on Instagram.
That goes the same for Threads as well. You can also find us on Twitter.
Ooh, tell them about Twitter.
Historically High. That's Historically HI on Twitter.
And if you want to email any of your comments or suggestions, where can they find us at, Adam?
At Historically High Podcast at gmail.com.
Gmail. All right, and back to the show.
Alrighty. So we come to 1929, and this is actually when the Rhineland occupation was ending. So as part of the Treaty of Versailles, it was to take place, for a few years. Then it would kind of be turned back over, or essentially wouldn't be occupied. Anymore. It would still be considered part of like France. Germany still wasn't able to come into it, but it wasn't like we were going to have consistent, like you would have some military presence, but not like additional military. You wouldn't have excessive military presence. So because of this, and because they don't need as large of a military force, guys that are serving there as officers with units are going to kind of maybe get reposted, someplace else. So after this point, Charles is like, well, fuck, I don't want to get stationed somewhere else. I'm going to go back, and I actually want a job at that staff college. So
he was so mad when he left staff college the first time.
He left as a student.
Yeah.
And so not only he's like, okay, the last time I was doing this, I was lecturing at just the military academy for like the younger guys. But now I want to come back, and I actually want to teach the officers, the guys that are officers that are going through their additional training. I think I've earned that right to do that.
In 2 years?
Yeah.
3 years?
Probably well, no, because this is 29 that this happens, and the last time he was there was before the Great War, which was in like the 20s.
Staff college was after, because it was when he was doing the lectures at Saint Cyr. Staff college was shit. It's on the other board.
I'm looking for it.
Staff college was like 24, 25, I want to say.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, that was 1920s is when that's when he was a lecturer at Saint Cyr. So it's still like 9 years later.
Okay, so maybe there's enough there.
But what has he been doing in the meantime? I mean, you're wanting to get basically become a professor. Well, it's regardless. He doesn't end up getting the gig because apparently during his time there, just as a student, he'd built up such a shitty reputation that a bunch of the staff there, they had like a threat of mass resignation. They're like, if you let him fucking teach here, we're all walking out the fucking door. So again, that has to say something kind of about the guy's character.
Partially because when he left the first time, he said that he wouldn't come back. He would come back as a teacher, but he wouldn't come back until he was ranked as a commandant.
Yeah.
So like he probably told them on the way out, he goes, when I'm a commandant and I come back here, all of you are going to have to respect me. And then all the teachers that are probably still there hear that and they're like, oh shit.
All the other like officers that are the teacher, because that's how it was. It's going to be other people in the military that you've pissed off. So Pétain ends up kind of talking him into this 2-year posting. He's like, listen, get out of France. You just spent some time in Germany, but like you need to kind of get out and gain some more experience. Maybe it's some of like the colonies or the French, what would you call them, French territories, like go to Africa, go see that stuff. So
Beirut is beautiful this time of year.
yeah, exactly. Go, travel around a little bit. So he takes a 2-year posting in Lebanon and Syria and actually serves as like the bureau chief. I don't know why, but that term is just so weird to me. The bureau.
It sounds very important. I'm sure it was.
But he was the bureau chief for military operations. He was serving under a guy named General Louis Paul Gaston de Gaulle du Granrot. Yeah, I got all of that. And had actually got the guy to provide him a reference that he should be in high command, that he should be serving some type of role in high command. Whether that be a coffee boy, I don't know. But I'm assuming he meant some type of like strategy or staffing position.
Good chance.
So 1931 rolls around. In the spring, he goes back to his good old buddy who he has talked shit about, but still goes back to for favors, Pétain. And he's like, I'd really like a staff gig, please. I really want to go work at that staff college. And again, the faculty is like, yeah, same answer as last time. No.
Still no.
Yep, still a hard no, even 2 years later. So he then asked for a special lecture job to lecture on the conduct of war to the staff school and a senior staff college for fucking generals known as the School for Marshals. So his counter offer after the staff says no, he's like, okay, hold on. What I'll do is I'll get a job as a special lecturer. So I'm not technically a teacher at the school, but in addition to also lecturing the staff school, I also want to go lecture at the fucking School for Marshals, where I'll be lecturing generals on the conduct of war.
Sounds like overwhelming confidence to me.
Pétain instead advises a post at the General Secretariat of the Supreme War Council. So he's like, okay, I hear you, Charles. Why don't we get you another staff job away from you don't want to lecture those kids and generals and everything. Rah, 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 rah. No, let's get you in and get that foot in the door for maybe like high command. And you could serve like, as a super important general secretary. And so he's like, okay, yeah, I think I'll go ahead and do that. Knowing full well he wasn't getting the fucking lecturer position.
But does that not sound like such a cool job? The General Secretary of the Supreme War Council?
Yes. The more words are in the title, I feel like the less important the job is, if I'm being honest with you.
Oh, I hear Supreme War Council and then General Secretary. I'm like, so you're the...
Think of Eisenhower, Supreme Commander. When you're having to add more words, it means you're trying to go ahead and shoehorn positions in there, I think. And I'm sure it was a legitimate position, because in 1932, the end of the year, he gets promoted to lieutenant colonel.
Well, this is again where I feel like the Pétain thing kind of finally sets in, because in the 1930s, he's pushing this idea of tanks and heavy artillery with rapid maneuvers over trench warfare. He didn't like the Maginot Line because this Maginot Line that's going to happen is just a defensive structure that's going to try to funnel the attack on other sides of it through the Ardennes and through, not Belgium. Belgium's the Ardennes side.
Luxembourg?
Possibly, yes.
So we'll also do an episode like on the Maginot Line.
Oh, yeah.
But basically what it was is, think of it kind of in the same sense of like the Atlantic Wall that the Nazis built. The Maginot Line was built as a prevention from Germany invading France or invading in mass. They would have to be funneled, like Adam said, kind of through areas that were more heavily defended. And basically the Maginot Line wasn't just like a wall or anything like that. It was a series of like fortifications, gun bunkers. Also, they called them dragon's teeth. They were basically just concrete like barriers and spikes that would prevent tanks from getting through. You still had to have bridges open because people still needed to travel back and forth. Yeah. But these were essentially preventing like en masse, like troop movements and armor movements. It also had natural fortifications. The Ardennes forest wasn't really heavily defended because they were like, oh, no one's ever going to come through here. It's the fucking Ardennes forest. And so the way that De Gaulle looked at it, he was like, we can't have an economic defense. This is building the Maginot Line is basically you guys saying we don't have to worry about having a very strong military here in France and have all this, the tanks and the armor and being mechanized and everything, because the Maginot Line will basically serve as like, the same thing with like the Spartans. It was going to funnel them into a small area, and we would be able to then attack that area and it would be more easily defended. And he was like, okay, but you still have to have, we still need to rapidly respond to that. And honestly, the Maginot Line, not all of it's being watched. Like they could come in and do construction on a large portion of it and remove a whole bunch of obstacles and obstructions and get a whole bunch of people through. So you guys are banking on this, basically this insanely long defensive line that has a bunch of blind spots in it.
Well, the way that you describe it that way, it sounds like it's just a bad idea. And this is at a time in this interwar period where French politics have just kind of gone off the rails. There's changes in government all the time. There's this one solid belief, though, that when you lose 25% of the male population in France, maybe if there is some sort of a fight, it needs to be more of a, you're fighting the barrier because we don't want to put as many people out there on the battlefield to potentially lose again.
And at the same time, De Gaulle is saying that exact thing. He's like, why don't we just put a bunch of the guys in fucking armored vehicles and make them be able to move really fast and be able to change positions and shift strategies so we're not in the same situation that lost us 1.3 million guys. So even his argument, is trying to help that fact. Like, we don't need to have this insanely huge force. We just need it to be well armored and well trained. And he actually wrote a book, I think, in 1934 that proposes this mechanization of infantry. And the emphasis was on a core group of 100,000 elite soldiers and 3,000 tanks. And so right after he writes this book, he ends up also, I'm trying to remember kind of through what association, but he meets this guy that's kind of a maverick politician whose last name is Renaud.
Oh, yes, not Leclerc, Renaud.
Yeah.
So this book that Chris was talking about was called Towards a Professional Army. And it kind of went off like a fart in the wind. It only sold 700 copies in France.
But it was big in Germany, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So
Apparently,
like 1,000 copies.
The Germans were a little bit more of a fan of this book, which I wonder if...
Hey, tanks, we have all those.
Well, you got to wonder if there was ever a point in time when De Gaulle hears what the Germans are doing and what they're using. He's like, wait a second. This sounds familiar.
He pulls up his book and flips through the pages. God damn it.
Oh, they stole it. I had to Google it because I wondered if there was ever a chance, like kind of how we went through and found bin Laden's porn stash, if when we went through Hitler's library, if there was ever one of these books that De Gaulle had written that had been found in like Hitler's private library or at the Bird's Nest or whatever. There was never a De Gaulle book found in any of Hitler's areas. That doesn't mean that he wasn't taking advice from dudes that had seen it before too. Mm-hmm. So there's a great chance that De Gaulle played maybe even a little bit of influence in Germany.
If you have a situation like Europe where at some point everyone's fighting everyone, I do feel like it would give you a leg up because this is at a time when like surveillance is really not a thing. No. You can't really figure out what other people are doing unless someone is reporting it and seeing it directly with their eyes. So to get a sense of an advantage on your enemy, it would make sense that you would try to read things that would be applicable to how they would perform in their military. So you're like, okay, the French are kicking around, or the French are kicking around this idea of a mechanized army. They're like, are they serious about it? And they're like, no, he's only sold 700 copies. In France, they're like, okay, I guess they're not really worried about it, but let's keep doing that.
Yeah.
In 1937, this is when he gets his promotion to full colonel. That's at the end of the year, and he gets to be known by, he's not a general at this point, but he gets the nickname General Motors. And basically because he is just so like fervent about this idea of like this mechanized army and everything like that, that I imagine everybody is just like, oh fuck, here comes De Gaulle. And he comes in, he's like, hey, did you guys hear about the tanks? And they're like, yeah, Charles, you told us about the tanks already. He's like, we need a lot more of them. It's all going to be about tanks, guys. And he's like, yeah, it's about tanks, Charles. Okay, later, guys. Talk to you later. And he's like, that fucking guy.
See you, General Motors.
Mm-hmm. He's like, oh, sweet name. And they're like, yeah, that's not a compliment.
That's not what you think it is. But at the same time, in that same year, in 1937, he does take command of the 507th Tank Regiment. So General Motors is taking command of a tank regiment, which sounds like kind of a match made in heaven. I wonder if that was almost like to appease him and be like, yeah, play with him now that you've been talking about him.
You got to imagine that he was just fully erect
Oh,
for
hog
like
heaven.
months
Yes.
at a time.
Mm-hmm. He probably just had him fire him up so he could listen to him.
Every time he heard like the squeaking of like the tracks coming in, he's just like, fuck. God, fucking rotate the turret.
We see this outbreak of World War II. We see them take Poland. I believe it was right after they took Poland that France declared war on Germany.
I believe so.
And so you're going to get thrust into action. He commands the 5th French Army's Tank Division at the outbreak of World War II. He's given command of the 4th Armored Division while the Germans begin their attack on May 10th, 1940 into France.
I think he has like 5 battalions, and I say that like you're supposed to know how many troops are in a battalion or whatever it is. I didn't look it up either, but it's a bunch of guys.
A battalion's a lot of people.
Yeah, so, and he's given control of 5 of them because like you said, he's commanded the 5th Army's tanks, and he's in the Alsace, which is kind of like the Rhine River plain. So he's going to be in the area where the Germans are trying to go ahead and snag that like first and foremost.
Yeah, he's right there. De Gaulle activates his forces May 12th, and they're to attack the German advance on May 17th.
Really quick before that. So, and I don't know if this was just something they had to do for political reasons, kind of like political points. So, like early in 1940, so the war is just popping off.
Mm-hmm.
So, de Gaulle proposes to that politician friend, Renaud, to appoint him as the Secretary General of the War Council. The Secretary General of the War Council is the prime government military advisor. So he's basically the guy that's telling the government who approves of the other stuff what they need to do. And Renaud is like, you know what? I don't think I'm going to be able to really do that.
So I can guarantee you, he was the only guy that asked for that position.
Oh, yeah. and one of the reasons he didn't end up doing it is because in March, Renaud is the prime minister.
Oh.
And all of a sudden, and I don't know if he wasn't wanting to give him that position because people would be like, ooh, he just made a questionable decision. Like, he's like, I can't do anything sketchy right now. I'm trying to become the PM. So he gets the PM, and de Gaulle is like, fuck yes, I'm getting that war council position. And he ends up getting snubbed to choose a guy. So basically, you had like a larger political faction.
Yeah.
They're the ones that he needed the support from to get the position as prime minister. One of their caveats was like, you're going to put our guy in as the Secretary General of the War Council. And so he ends up having to give this job to the other guy. And so de Gaulle is like, I imagine de Gaulle has a notebook, like on that scene with Ryan on The Office when someone wrongs him and he writes down the names. I imagine at that point he just writes down Renaud's name in the notebook.
And it was probably after Renaud tells him what happened. He's like, well, just let me go talk to these guys. And Renaud's like, no, don't go talk to any of them. That's not going to help.
I got something cooking. I'm going to mention your name. I'm going to get you in good with them, and then I'll bring you in. And then as soon as he hit PM, he was like, yes, the position's mine. He's like, back up, giving it to somebody else. But I will give you the 4th Armored Division as a consolation prize. So you're going to get your tanks back. Oh,
that's how it came to be. Okay.
I'm going to give you your tanks back. And he's like, great. Now I have to have an erection again for the next 4 months. So this is kind of earlier in the year in 1940, and by May 7th, he was already getting like his command staff assembled and everything, probably pulling in all of his guys that he knew were loyal and everything. And this leads right into the Battle of France. So literally he's assembling his staff 3 days before the Nazis invade France. And so the 15th rolls around, he's got all his guys together, and they're like, okay, you need to, well, not all of his guys, probably like his command staff, but they're like, okay, you need to go hold off the Nazis. And he's like, yeah, I only have like a third of my strength right now of what I'm supposed to have out of this armored division. They're like, yeah, tough break, man. But the Nazis are kind of, they're gaining a lot of ground. You're going to need to go kind of hold them up a little bit.
Go tell them to slow down. See what happens.
Yeah, just buy us a little bit of time. That's all you're supposed to do. So we come to the Battle of Montcornet on May 17th. Now, this is kind of an engagement that takes place over the course of several days. And because the battle for France was what, like 6 weeks? It took him 6 weeks to end up signing the surrender.
I wish that sounded like a longer amount of time.
Stuff is very condensed in how quickly it happens. So May 17th, he has 150 vehicles. I don't know how many of them were tanks, but like armored artillery, things like that. So he ends up engaging with the Germans on May 19th, gets his ass beat, and is provided orders to withdraw. And he's like, you're breaking up, going through a tunnel. So he basically ignores the orders to withdraw and basically fights, I think, for like one more day, and then ends up retreating on the 20th.
Well, he lost almost a third of his vehicles in their first attack.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty...
He came to like 90, lost like 30, and then they had to resupply him up to like 150.
Yep.
And then he ends up getting beat pretty handily again. Now, during this time, he ends up getting beat, but he does make a little bit of like an advance on like a counterattack. And because there are so few victories during the Battle of France, this is like lauded. And they're like, yes, De Gaulle was successful actually in an attack against the Germans. And everyone's like, yeah.
He didn't win it. He forced one retreat.
Exactly.
Come on.
Apparently it was a big enough deal because literally 3 days later after his retreat, he's promoted to brigadier general. And at this point, this kind of shocked me, but he's 50 at this point.
Yeah, that's pretty old. You missed the most important part of that, though. Because they had so few victories and he got one retreat out of the German army, they made him go on French radio and give a talk about their successes.
Yeah. Dude, when you're just trying to like, you're getting beat that bad, you got to try to boost morale in any little way that you can.
Yeah, but how crazy is that, though, that it's like, what'd you do? Oh, you forced one retreat out of the German army, and then they probably came back after you retreated yourself? Yeah, no, go on the radio and start touting that information. And there's something very interesting that I heard a historian say on a podcast. It might have been the audiobook. When he's talking about De Gaulle, he says that De Gaulle was the face of a revolution that started out his career as the voice of a revolution.
Yeah.
Because nobody knew who he was. He wasn't a household name. Nobody had seen his face. And that's getting off a little course because he's going to make another big radio address. But that was the thing about him, was he was a good enough orator, and it happened to be just the right time to where he could get these people through the radio and kind of like strengthen their resolve.
I mean, he had a lot of assistance with that. Kind of leading up to that, and how it's kind of weird that he's so unknown.
Yeah.
But then when you think about, the next series of events that we're going to talk about, again, everything's happening while France is under attack. And because it's, the 1940s, it's not like every promotion is being sent out. People aren't like, writing home and making big announcements. So you're getting all of these people that nobody's ever heard of being promoted into these different positions, and no one has really heard of them. People probably hear of the biggest generals and know who the prime minister is and people within parliament and things like that. But, there's a lot of brigadier generals still at this point. He's not just like a main guy. On June 1st, though, he's actually in Paris, and he's getting, I think, fitted for his brigadier general's uniform. And he ends up running into Renaud and the commander-in-chief at the time, who was Maxime Weygard. And this guy ends up being like a major player in the Vichy French government, but ends up meeting these two guys and basically suggests to them that they take again, I think this is one of those situations where they end up meeting with him. They're sitting down and he just bulldozes them with this. He's like, so this is what we need to do. And they're like, oh, fuck, we can't even get the appetizers first before we start into this shit. He's like, you need to take the remaining 4 armored corps. You need to actually merge them into 3 so all of them are stronger.
Yeah.
And you need to make sure all 3 of them are under my command. And they're like, okay, I think probably coming on a little bit strong at that point. But June 5th rolls around and he's ended up making the Undersecretary of State for National Defense and War. Again, so many different fucking positions. I feel like some of these are just getting made up and have no idea what their capacity or what kind of their actual role is.
Well, and you have a general secretary and undersecretary. Like, there's all these different secretaries. I'm assuming the undersecretary is below the general secretary.
I don't know.
But
Could just be because it's the Undersecretary of State.
Yeah.
So it could be under the Secretary of State, who could be the second guy.
And this is why De Gaulle is so frustrating to me, and I think to you too, is had he just shut up after he said that they needed to condense the 4 into the 3, that feels like pretty sound thought and logic, right?
That sounds like something you can take and be like, hey, like this guy had this good idea that we should take these to make them stronger. And they'd be like, okay, that's good. And he's like, but he also wants to then command like, all 3 of them. They're like, oh no, that's fucking crazy. No, we're not doing any of that.
As soon as he keeps talking is when he wrecks stuff for me.
Pretty much.
Like you hear it and you're like, that's a good idea. Under me, that's probably a bad idea.
Well, Renaud puts him in that position. Pétain and Weygard both object to it. On June 9th, so 4 days later after he's made this position, he flies to London to meet Churchill. To basically, they know kind of the writings on the wall, what's going to happen here, and they're talking evacuation plans. How do we get as much of the French army across over to Great Britain or down to North Africa where we're still have that area? We need to basically get as many of the forces that can then be captured or used against us away from the Germans. Yeah. And on the 13th, that's when they kind of think that De Gaulle, he has a meeting and kind of gets recruited into this idea of being like, hey, we think you actually need to, they're looking at him, they know what position he has, and they're like, we think you probably need to get out of France at this point and maybe come over and start kind of working on this resistance and facilitating essentially how we're going to try to maintain a presence in France.
Which he's not the top dog. He's not the guy that you kind of want to keep over in France. Like he's low enough on the totem pole that he probably won't be missed too much in France. He
hasn't mentioned the word surrender yet is the biggest thing. Because essentially, Churchill's been in contact with the prime minister with
Maxine
Renard.
Yeah.
And they got to be, no one can just flee. Not everyone can flee and just leave the French to fend for themselves. So they have to be like, hey, things aren't going well. This is going to be our option if we want to try to stay somewhat whole in this situation. We're going to have to surrender and accept occupation. Churchill doesn't want to fucking hear that. And here's from this De Gaulle guy. He's like, oh no, I'd never fucking even consider that.
Had they moved out of Paris yet?
Not yet. And I think that's one of the reasons that they kind of recruit him. And they're like, okay, we need that attitude. We can't have this surrender attitude that your government is talking about. So you need to get up here and when you get here, we'll talk about how we're going to figure this thing out. So it only takes him until June 17th. So even 4 days after that, he packs up and heads for Britain. And he's basically like, peace, France. I'm going to go up here and I'm going to start doing my thing to try to make plans to then retake our country.
Yeah, it's pretty tough when you get June 8th. I believe it was Maxine just tells him kind of flat out like, yeah, war's over, man. We're not going to be able to survive this one. So then, yeah, the very next day you fly to London, you hear Churchill kind of gassing you up a little bit, and then you go back over there and Churchill almost gives him maybe more confidence. And then after that happens, he goes back to France and he sees the situation and he's just like, oh no.
Churchill has no other option. He knows if France surrenders, that every bit that France were to hold out buys them time to kind of shore up their defenses and try to do something.
Yeah.
The fact that they're like 6 weeks in, or they're probably 4 or 5 weeks in at this point, and they're like, man, we're going to have to surrender. He's like, fuck that. He's like, you guys aren't going to be able to put up any type of a fight. And then he hears this De Gaulle guy and he's like, I can use this guy to actually try to keep some semblance of a fight going on, at least at some sense of maybe not an organized army, but a resistance that is much more useful to have than to not have. So yeah, I'll take everything I can get. And this De Gaulle guy is the one guy that I can count on who's not going to roll over.
Little did he know that the only reason that De Gaulle was going to refuse to roll over is because he was just the most stubborn dude that there was.
The asparagus does not fall.
Yeah. On June 17th as well, I think part of the reason why he gets out is because we get a radio recording from France where this new government that's being established after Renaud basically takes off is this Vichy regime. And this Vichy regime is basically saying, we've lost the war, it's over, we need to sign an armistice.
We're giving the Germans basically the northern half of our country for kind of free reign, and we're getting to keep kind of the southern portion, but we don't get to keep doing things like we've always been. It's not like, oh, you're just France light now. You guys get to keep on being like French. No, we still have to make sure that we're paying our homage and our dues to them, and they're actually in charge of us. They're just letting us keep some semblance of a French government.
And you heard what their physical or their financial payment was, right?
It was 400 million
Francs
a day.
Yep.
To pay for, to basically in recompense and restitution for Germany having to make war on them. It's like, you dented so many of our fucking tanks and you killed our guys and you cost us a bunch of planes. So you're going to need to pay us 400 million francs a day to make up for it. In addition to probably us kind of strip mining your shit, putting U-boat pins all over your coast, basically just having, the Germans run the show.
Well, and to drive this point home more, where is that armistice signed?
Oh, the armistice is signed in the railway car that the Germans were forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles in. We talked about that during the Hitler episode, and then he promptly blew up the railway car.
Yeah, which the punishments that we've talked about in every other one of these episodes, the punishments coming out after the war that plagued Germany and kind of helped lead Hitler into power were a lot of like overwhelming debts that they had to pay.
And now you're seeing it come back.
Yeah. And so, when that number comes across and he slides the paper across, you're like, don't be big, don't be big, don't be big.
It's like 400 million. And he's like, daily.
And what do you do? Because you're already in there to sign the armistice with them. And like I said earlier, I think the idea that France kind of gave up and capitulated was because they were the only country to sign an armistice with Germany that was fighting them.
Yeah.
So in that situation, there's almost like a scapegoat of like, yeah, no, France was complicit in what was going on. France wasn't complicit in what was going on. The Vichy regime that took over France is what was going on. And like I said earlier, if you don't have that government there, you get a puppet government installed, and it almost looks better because that way when history takes a look back, they don't see that there's actually technically a French government, quote unquote, that's in charge when this is happening.
I think that's why they always make sure they're like, it's fucking Vichy. It's the Vichy French. They got to make sure they add that part onto it.
That's logical to me. To say that makes total sense because there has to be a separation.
Confederacy.
Yeah. But for the first little while, it wasn't like a terrible occupation for the French until the French people started seeing this spillover of the Vichy, like starting to give in to some of these German demands.
It takes some time for it to settle in, for life to kind of change. And I think they said 41 is when it really dialed up as far as like people starting to be like, okay, we're not good with this long term.
Well, again, to advance this Vichy belief system and how bad it was, when Hitler came into France for the Jews, the Vichy were like, they're there. There was no attempt to try to save these people, even though they were French Jews. They were born in France. They were just as French as everybody else. They had been there for generations at that point in time. And the Vichy almost looked at them like they weren't true Frenchmen because they were Jewish people.
Like anything to save our fucking skins.
Yeah.
Is basically, that was the motto.
Yeah. And to juxtapose that with June 18th, De Gaulle gives this radio address on BBC Radio to France.
Day after he lands.
The thing that I find funny about this is it's hit on in almost every like documentary or podcast or piece of literature about this whole point in time. But the BBC thought that this was so insignificant that there's no recording left. They never saved the recording.
No. So the speech on the 18th, so he does this radio broadcast to the French to resist. So do you remember, did you write down what date the actual armistice with France was signed?
Shit. No. I want to say it was the 17th, the same day as the radio thing, but it might have been the 19th, now that I think about it.
So this radio broadcast basically has a very simple message. It's that France is going to resist, not to give up hope, resist in the occupation in any way that you can, that the Vichy or this new regime are not, the real French. And basically that, this isn't over yet. And like you said, they had a transcript of it. They didn't even put it on audio recording. What they did is they think it was kind of just to get him out there and listen to this broadcast. It was just to kind of get the message out in one way, shape, or form that France was still going to be fighting.
4 days after, June 22nd is when they signed the armistice.
Okay. So it was already, writing was on the wall that he was getting out because he knew what was coming. So, and it's basically to put a separation between, like, again, this new regime that was probably going to serve under the Germans, and then also like what would become like the Free French forces or something like that, right?
Yeah.
We'll get to it in just a second.
And during this radio broadcast, he never explicitly says it. I think he says it later on in another one. He gives like 60 radio broadcasts over this whole point in time. But the general message is we may have lost the battle, but we're going to win the war.
It was generally for more show in the beginning, because if you are, most of the people that are going to be hearing this broadcast on the BBC, going to be the Brits.
Yeah.
Now, it's going to probably be translated because not a lot of British people speak French, and he's also speaking French to the French people because that's who he's addressing. But when you hear this is, him come on and say, this is Charles De Gaulle, leader of the French, resistance, and the Brits who just heard that French surrendered, and that the fucking crosshairs are moving on to you next, to know, or at least to have the perception that France is still fighting in one way, shape, or form, that has to be such a morale boost.
Huge.
And so I do think that Churchill looks at this and says, I don't fucking know what this guy's capable of. I don't know if this will work. I just know that the fucking French just fell, and I got to try to quell panic. And so I need this guy to come on who is, like you said, nobody knows who this guy is. In the beginning, he is just this voice and this name on the radio. He probably has told people, who he is and like how long he served and like what his rank is.
Oh, that was how he probably started it,
but
for sure.
His message is essentially that the French are going to resist. And he, within these circles and everything of this French resistance, and then not even just of the French resistance, but also of like just the French people in general, this is their guy that's leading the charge for the independence of France, who's actually French, who's fighting for them as far as they know. So he becomes this, I don't want to say messianic figure, but he kind of becomes the guy that people who are longing for, free France and end of the occupation, the only people they have to look to, because the Vichy have kind of abandoned them to go down south and are just like, sorry.
Well, there also wasn't, they said as far as occupations go, the French occupation still wasn't good, but it was looked at as a little bit better than everywhere else that they had occupied.
Hey, come on. No kidding. They fucking hated the Bolsheviks.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to wreck France. France is fucking beautiful.
Well,
and that was going to be that was going to be the living space.
Lebensraum.
The Lebensraum for like the oil and the resources and the breadbasket. That was going to go out into fucking Russia and all that kind of area. The place, no one's going to fucking vacation and build resorts and want to go build a house in that area. Well, France was going to be their fucking luxury territory. It was going to be fancy Germany.
But what else did it have, too?
Resources? The coast?
Human resources.
Oh, yes. A workforce that while they were getting every able-bodied man that they could to actually serve in the military to fucking take care of the Eastern Front.
German able-bodied men.
They had to bring in people to work in the German factories.
Yeah, and this sounds like probably the worst deal that I've ever heard, because part of this armistice, and later on, they called it voluntary something, but it was basically like drafting people into the workforce. And as Chris mentioned,
what was the deal?
As Chris mentioned earlier that we were talking about with the losses in World War I, the capture at the Battle of France was 1.7 million soldiers, which was 10% of the French male population at that point in time.
Correct, sir.
And for every 3 people that volunteered or were forced to go work in these German factories, they would release one of those soldiers.
I think they said overall there were about 600,000 French that went to go work over in German factories.
So in order to get all of these soldiers out of being rounded up and being captured, being POWs, they would have had to have sent 5.1 million workers to Germany.
You gotta also imagine that a lot of those POWs were probably working in some capacity.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But that's just like if
fucking
you're
stitching boots or like making uniforms, or not the fucking sick Hugo Bosses.
No, this is the lower end, the general infantry stuff. But at the same point in time, once you've had all of these soldiers, basically your whole army rounded up as POWs, you have to find a different way to beat the Germans. And this is where the idea of these everyday French commoners that start to get drafted into the resistance.
Dude, I cannot fucking wait to do the French resistance episode. It doesn't suck we're doing this, but this makes it to where we have to branch out for another 5, 6, 7 episodes before we can revisit this time frame.
Well,
and especially in France.
This is technically only the 3rd French episode that we've done. And one of them was Andre the Giant.
Yeah.
So you have Andre, of course, that was fantastic. You have Napoleon, and now you have De Gaulle. So I think that tells you sort of the importance that De Gaulle was out of this whole thing, but it opens us up more doors to France. And to be honest, I don't really understand all of France still because it's such just kind of a frenetic place. But there's so many other cool things, and I think the coolest thing, besides just learning about how much of a badass De Gaulle was and how potentially dictatorish he was, and on our side, there's also this whole idea, just like the SOE, just like the OSS.
With that potentially word.
Yeah, well, we'll get to that. But we learned about the SOE. We did that episode. We've talked about the OSS a little bit. We haven't given it its own episode yet. But the French resistance was the equivalent and so important because they were the ones that were behind enemy lines and occupied France and were able to start bringing in all of these SOE agents to keep them undercover to be able to run amok and ruin the Germans' plans to defend France.
D-Day.
Yeah.
Huge. Cutting supply lines, bombing depots, derailing fucking trains and shit like that to slow down the reaction to allow the Allies time to establish that beachhead. Like, fucking looking forward to that episode. Getting back to De Gaulle, sorry.
Well, we're still going to hang out with the resistance.
We are. I want to get to essentially the Vichy essentially turning right around as soon as they find De Gaulle's doing this.
Oh, yeah.
And basically condemn him to death. Well,
In
actually,
absentia.
Yes, in absentia, they condemn him to death. So he's basically now an enemy of... Okay, at this point, once the Vichy government was established, that was the established and recognized like French government. Churchill wasn't like, oh, De Gaulle, you're here, I'm recognizing you as the legitimate French government. It wasn't like that. They had to still deal with the Vichy government because they still controlled a lot of France, a lot of coastline, a lot of places that could be invaded to start taking France back.
And a navy.
And also a navy. And so, yeah, because once France surrendered, they were forced to move the navy down to the south of France, I think closer basically to Italy. So like Italy could kind of babysit it. And then also to kind of boost their power if they needed it in the Mediterranean. So, yeah, condemns him. The French Equatorial Africa states come into play huge here because De Gaulle isn't just trying to build this resistance in mainland France, in northern France. He's doing that, but he's like, I gotta fucking get the ball rolling on this. There's other places that I can try to draw people from, places that maybe have actual troops there, like an already established army that's a little bit more effective. And he starts looking around at all these places they have in North Africa and is like, okay, we can make this work.
It's a very Napoleonic look at it, too, because one of his criticisms of Napoleon was he had gone so far that eventually when Napoleon fell, they had lost things that were traditionally France, too. So knowing that these colonies were a part of the French Empire, De Gaulle was still fighting for the entire French Empire. He didn't want just France back. He wanted to keep everything intact that they had had before. And now these dudes that just sentence him to death in absentia, and if he gets caught, he's probably going to get strung up. You got to find a place where you can, a soft underbelly, but at the same time, you also want to make sure that if you do take France back, you have all of its holdings still intact in equatorial Africa.
I think you also have to play with the resources you have.
Yeah.
And I think a big thing about that was this wasn't like De Gaulle went up to Churchill and was like, hey, I need this many men. I need to do this and this and this. Churchill was like, okay, how can we establish a resistance? We need to start funneling, spies in there, all of that stuff. He wasn't going to provide an army to De Gaulle. He needed those guys elsewhere. He was just having De Gaulle basically kind of do this, like wage this basically proxy war and everything. So De Gaulle's like, okay, I got to find some place also that I can sell to the British because I'm still going to need support. I can't just go down there by myself and all of a sudden, the troops are just going to flock to me and these countries are going to, declare for me because I'm nothing. I'm just the guy that's fighting for, free France. All these territories technically are now under the loyalty of the Vichy government. So he creates this thing called, you got to get fancy names in here, the Empire Defense Council, and basically invites all the colonies of France to basically leave the Vichy to join him.
At one point in time after he creates it, do you know how many people were a part of the Empire Defense Council?
When he first did it?
Yeah.
Like one?
Him.
Oh, yes, him. Oh, you
that
mean
was
individually.
It.
Yes.
He created it. He gave himself the head and is like, everybody else come in. And for a minute there, Churchill was like, why did you just create something that you're the only person that's a part of? Like, what are you doing here?
He's like, let me cook. I got nothing else. I got to start trying to get the ball rolling on this.
Did the Vichy have one of these? No.
Crazy fucking thing is most of them do by 1943.
There's a little trip that he takes down there.
He does, but we're getting up to that and everything. What also helps to kind of sell this as well is the British are already planning. They're like, okay, we can't attack straight across the channel. Germany's closest to that point. It's not going to work.
Yeah.
That was already the plan then to attack the underbelly because they knew Italy was weaker. And they knew once they got into Vichy territory, they could possibly then get them to kind of go against Germany. It was a good chance they were going to try. It was the best option available, basically. So Operation Torch actually goes off in 1942 with the Allied invasion of French North Africa. And at that point, because you had the forces of the Americans and the British doing that, all of a sudden, de Gaulle can go down there and have like a buffer between him and the Germans who had been in North Africa at the time. He can now start putting into place kind of raising his own forces basically down there. I think the first one to declare for him was Chad.
Algiers was technically part of France because it was a part of it.
Okay.
Algiers right off the bat was cool with him.
Okay.
Because that's where he ends up moving the Empire Defense Council. I think it was in like May of 43 that he moves that down there.
Which means he goes down there, right?
Yeah. Yep. That's his base, which I'm sure at this point in time, because we haven't really harped on it a whole lot, but we've harped on him being a thorn in everybody's side. Churchill was not a big fan of him. And not only was Churchill not a big fan of him, FDR was a real anti-de Gaulle, pro-French. We need to find somebody else to do this.
No, I had that written down. Ike liked him. And I think Ike liked him because he was like, this guy is going to do things that I don't have to worry about doing. And I don't really have to commit any manpower or anything. And if we end up like losing him and it doesn't end up working out, it wasn't that big to begin with, but if he can somehow like start to cause like a ruckus and everything, that's just going to help me. And I think that's from Ike's standpoint of actually the one fighting the war and actually commanding it and everything versus the outlook of like Churchill, who had to deal with de Gaulle diplomatically.
Yeah.
And FDR, because while Ike liked him, the other ones were not fucking crazy.
Well, I think Ike liked him because he saw the war dog in him. He saw the commander in him. He saw just how crazy he was, and we're probably not going to talk about it.
Tanks? I fucking love tanks, man.
You don't have anything about the Bulge, right? in this?
No, I didn't see what happened during the Bulge.
They were down, I believe it was Strasbourg that they were trying to defend, and the Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower tells de Gaulle that they needed to pull French forces away and to not reinforce Strasbourg.
Charles, pull out. We never pull out.
We are the French, we never pull out.
We lost so many men, we can't afford to pull out.
So Ike's basically like, look, man, I'm the supreme commander in this situation. You need to pull your French forces out. He's like, yeah, I know your role. I've heard your spiel before. We ran into each other in North Africa. You told me all about it. You made me some promises that we'll talk about here coming up. But I'm not leaving. We're going to go reinforce Strasbourg and we're going to hold it. And Ike's like, well, shit, I can't let this guy try to outdo me. I'm the supreme commander. So he tells his U.S. troops to stay in there and to protect Strasbourg, and they end up successfully defending it. So I think that there's a little bit of like Ike seeing that in him, and it's almost like I can't let this guy outdo me because he's just crazy enough to pull something cool off. And maybe if I hang out with him for a little while, I'll get some credit for it too. And Ike didn't need credit for anything after this point in time because he basically taught a masterclass on D-Day. But at the same time, it was like de Gaulle was so annoying that he almost had to be respected because nobody has that much fight. There's like two other dudes that were this self-confident during this war. One of them was Stalin and the other one was Hitler.
He'll just annoy himself into your heart.
Yeah, exactly.
So FDR, I think, called him an apprentice dictator. And
not wrong.
Still, even up to like in 43, the United States didn't recognize any French government. I don't believe Britain did either.
I thought it was the Vichy still.
It was still the Vichy. What I'm saying though is even at the point in like 43, it's still to where they're having meetings with de Gaulle. They know who de Gaulle is and everything. They know that he's fighting for the portion of France that they actually like want, but they're still think because he doesn't have a foothold, the Vichy still hold the cards. They still have that power play.
So they're still also trying to negotiate with the Vichy to try to get a hold of it. Mm-hmm. One thing that we didn't mention that I kind of hinted towards earlier was we still have the whole issue of Churchill ordering the sinking of the Vichy Navy.
Okay, so and that makes complete sense. So you have essentially the Vichy who have allied themselves in essence, yeah, they're subservient too.
Yep.
And if the Germans were like, well, we need to use the Navy, they can't say no. So it's basically asset denial. So what happens is the British have to bomb the Vichy fleet. And it's not like they can be like, hey, get all the soldiers away from the boats. We're going to be doing that, even though like we're trying to be, not trying to be enemies here. Because then the Germans would hear about it and they would just launch planes and it wouldn't work. So they basically, I think it's 1,300.
Something around there.
Something around 1,300 French sailors are killed. And so this basically has the Vichy looking at like, okay, are we about to make a declaration of war against Britain? And because of that, there also has to be a little bit more of this reliance, I think, on de Gaulle.
Yeah,
as
for
kind
sure.
of more of the civil option for them.
They're
So
still definitely trying to keep the line of communication open with the Vichy because
they're playing both hands.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you don't need de Gaulle to get into that kind of south of France for an invasion and you can talk the Vichy into maybe turning a blind eye or letting you through that way, it's going to be major steps forward to try to take back France.
So D-Day rolls around, and so June 6, 1944, by June 14th in Bayeux, is it? Oh, Bayeux?
Bayeux, I think.
Bayeux, Normandy, becomes the capital of Free France.
Oh, yeah. Prior to that, because that was after D-Day, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, like we talked about, Eisenhower and de Gaulle kind of got along. They seemed to be friends. There was a little bit of respect both ways, I think. And when they were down in the French African colonies and they were getting everybody back on the Free French side and out of the hands of the Vichy, Eisenhower flies down there and personally meets with de Gaulle and assures him that a French force would liberate Paris.
De Gaulle kind of demands it. And
Well,
he's like, all right.
he demands it, but at the same time, Eisenhower sees him. He's like, okay, man, that's
Reasonable.
possible.
Yeah.
And not to mention,
I mean, we're literally going to be right behind you.
yeah, and that's it, was a French force would liberate Paris. That doesn't mean the French force. That doesn't mean only the French force. You're going to be there probably when we're out there smoking everybody else. And so after they have...
We have to get you to Paris.
Yeah, yep.
And get Paris to be surrendered before you can then drive in. He's like, so that's what you want? He's like, we.
And so after they end up kind of gaining all of this support back for the Free French in Africa, they go ahead and fly the French force all the way back up to the UK to prepare for D-Day. Now, I believe it was either the night before D-Day or maybe a couple days before D-Day, FDR is scheduled to give a speech over the radio. And what he's kind of saying is something along the lines of, we need to get into France and help France. We're going to be the main thrust into it.
He's not saying this before D-Day on the radio?
Well, what he's basically saying is, like, once we get into France, this is what we're going to have to do over there. And De Gaulle goes to Churchill and he's like, he can't say that. I'm the guy. And Churchill's like, no, he's going to say that on the radio. And De Gaulle goes, he can't say that because then that makes me look weak. I'm supposed to be going in there and trying to be the leader. And Churchill looks him dead in the eyes and he goes, if you're going to make me make a decision between you and Roosevelt, I'm going to go with Roosevelt every single time. And De Gaulle's like, okay, I guess that works for me. I can't lose you, even though multiple times during this whole entire thing, Churchill has to keep reminding me, he's like, we're on the same side in this. Yeah. And De Gaulle keeps telling him,
you're in my fucking house.
Yeah. De Gaulle keeps telling him, I'm not on your side. I'm on France's side. Like every single time, it's always,
how can food out of my fridge and now you want to fuck my wife?
Every
get
time
back
he brings
in your
it up,
booth, Charles, and get on the microphone.
Yeah, go talk on the radio, man. You have to understand, without us, you're not going to get back into France. So it's kind of moot point for you to be making plans to get back in there without us.
So the next series of events shows you how quickly De Gaulle is going to try to work to establish himself as essentially the leader of liberated France. So June 14th, that's when Bayeux, Normandy, is set as the capital of Free France. So they have a foothold. They know they're on the mainland. Essentially, they're looking for, the French resistance to kind of like rise up and like support them and everything. And on the 16th, 2 days later, flies to French Algiers, which is Algeria.
But how did he get a hold of Bayeux?
It was one of the places that was taken as part of the invasion.
He flies in for 1 day.
Yes.
Because Churchill lets him go in. And while he's there for 1 day, he leaves one of his, I guess, cabinet members or something like that, this guy named Francois Coulet. And he's like, you're in charge of Bayeux. And as they're leaving, he's like, why is this guy staying? He's like, oh, no. This is going to be the capital of Free France right now, and Coulet is in charge here.
It was a symbolic. It's not like that was going to be changed to the capital of France. It was symbolism of saying like, hey,
we're on the mainland.
We're on the mainland. We're here. We're ready to liberate France.
And Churchill's like, you can't do that. Eisenhower's like, you can't do that. We're allied forces. And he's like, trust me, it's just going to be easier. We helped you guys invade because I learned this during this portion, and I'm sure you had heard about it, but the French forces that were brought up from Africa helped on D-Day through a mission in the south.
Yeah.
Below everything else. So there's already French soldiers that are stationed in Bayeux, and they actually found it was easier to have Coulet there because he was able to get the French soldiers that were there kind of under command on the daily briefings that were happening there. So it was like they weren't happy that he was trying to shoehorn his way back onto the French continent or the mainland. But at the same time, it did make it a little bit easier for them. So it kind of was like we don't like that you're doing it, but as long as it helps.
So flies down to Algeria, make sure he takes care of business there. And I think at this point, he's making appearances.
Oh, yeah.
And he's like, hey, he knows they're in France. He knows he has to play this as though it's inevitable of them liberating France, because if they lose, it's all moot. But he stands everything to gain by doing this. So he goes and he establishes himself again in Algeria and is like popping in and being like, hey, just letting you guys know, we invaded France. I'm the one that made that happen. Remember that when you cast your ballots. He then goes to Rome.
Love it.
To meet the Pope.
A Catholic boy's dream.
Yep. And basically to be like, oh, hey, and introducing himself to the Pope. And he's like, I am the Pope. And he's like, I am the leader of Free France. and just basically name dropping and being like, remember my name.
Yep.
And so if it came up in conversation and someone else said someone else was leading France, the Poe would be like, wasn't it that Charles guy that the very tall one that came in? And he also meets the new Italian government. So he establishes himself with the new Italian government.
Post Mussolini.
They're fucking neighbors.
Yep.
They got to fucking be friendly. So he's like, hey, just let you know, I'm the guy. I'm the guy. When it eventually, you know, everything settles down, I'm the guy. And then August 25th, or sorry, July, he is in D.C. meeting with FDR, again, pressing the flesh.
This might be one of my favorite stories from this.
Okay, so when a foreign leader visits, it is customary to give them a 21-gun salute. And I believe, does that involve 7 guns firing 3 times, or have they ever had 21 guns all at one time?
I think it's 3 volleys of 7.
Okay, so that is customary as a sign of respect. Now, when a dignitary or like a high-standing military
General
comes, they get a 17-gun salute. Would you care to venture a guess which one FDR gave to De Gaulle?
I'm going to go 17. Excuse me. 17-gun salute.
How do you do 17?
You just got one guy maybe that waits for the last volley. Like you have 8 fire the first time and you have 9 fire the second time.
Okay, so here's what I'm curious about. Is the disrespect evident from the beginning when you walk out and it's not 7 guys? So you know instantly and you're like, they're not going to get to fucking 21.
He's sitting there doing the math and he's like, this is a bad number.
Or do you think they have the 7 guys out, but when they're firing, some of the guys don't fire? Or do you think that'd get too confusing because they couldn't tell if they were all firing? I think there's a guy missing. I think it's evident from the get-go.
Possibly. I think probably the first sign of disrespect is when he got off the plane and FDR just refused to stand to greet him. That's kind of messed up.
Buddy. Buddy.
Yeah, he just sat there in his chair and probably shook his hands from the chair. How disrespectful is that?
Moving on. August 25th, Paris is liberated.
Oh, it was so sweet, too. Just this whole idea. And during that talk that they had when he goes over there and he meets Roosevelt, he successfully lobbies for this Paris liberation as a top priority because it's a sign of strength to be able to reclaim the capital of Paris. And as soon as you do that, all of the Germans that are in the countryside are like, well, shit, do we need to come take that back or do we need to start hightailing it back? They're moving pretty good.
We've talked about this like on so many like of the World War II episodes where it's about like capturing a place is almost as much about its strategic value as it is about the like symbolic value.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So, yeah. I mean, and it's not a hard sell either. It's not like Paris is that far into northern France, but they could have simply just spread themselves along the coast and probably committed more resources. Mm-hmm. But to liberate that is to essentially let all of Germany and the rest of the world know that Paris, which you can name, you know, if anyone is going to name one city in France and you ask, it's going to be Paris. It's going to be like if someone captured like New York and we got that back, how symbolic that would be. Like that's the fucking, you know, right there. But to capture Paris would be such a demoralizing blow to Hitler, who made such a huge deal about capturing it, that, you know, that was worth what it was going to take to delay efforts elsewhere.
Well, and that was sort of the odd thing about it. Maybe it was just because there was a general retreat out of Paris. They only rounded up 5,000 German soldiers that surrendered. Like that doesn't seem like that big of a number for such a big city.
That wasn't even thought about. Imagine the headlines.
Oh,
Paris surrendered 5,000. No, it's not that. It's Paris fucking liberated.
But in the grand scheme of things, when you look at logistics there and everything like that, capturing 5,000 soldiers isn't like capturing 1.7 million in all of France.
No. But what is Paris worth?
Yeah, it's
all
worth
of
its
the
weight in
baguettes
gold.
and cheese and
Unfortunately, yeah. Unfortunately, that happens on August 25th. And on August 26th, the Wehrmacht goes ahead with revenge bombings in Paris that killed, I want to say it was thousands. Just a very quick reprisal.
They were not happy.
You might have a little bit more on this story than I did because I do not remember where De Gaulle was going. But they were marching there. it was either a day or two after, and it was an assembly or something like that they were going to. And there were still some Vichy holdouts in machine gun nests. And as they were walking down oh shit, what are they?
It's so crazy you don't think about that, but there were at times French fighting against French.
Yeah. I believe it was called the Champs-Élysées. And as he's walking down, there's literal machine gun fire like hitting all around him and at his feet. But he is just striding down the street. And one of the reporters that was there was like, it looked like he was just walking on clouds. Like he couldn't be touched. There was something magical about it. And to his point, at this point in time with De Gaulle, there was somebody that was marching pretty close behind him and like almost starting to overtake him. And he just leans over to him. He's like, slow down. I'm walking in first.
Is this a French reporter?
I'm sure. Well, I heard it in multiple places that he was just kind of walking along there as the gunfire was going on. Like he refused to be stopped. He was just going to keep going.
I don't deny that he was there where there was gunfire, but stuff like that always gets.
Oh yeah,
it was probably like a block away, and he's just
up.
Like, oh yeah, he was totally just like right down the street
for sure. Like he didn't even hear the gunfire. At that point in time,
they're like, yeah, he was in Paris while they were still fighting in Paris, like on different sides of the cities. Like he was definitely in Paris, though.
Yeah. De Gaulle still needs a little help from his old buddy Ike. He asked him to send U.S. forces into Paris just as like a show of force. They were rerouted. I'm sure they were probably heading out into the countryside or heading more maybe down south towards Germany. But Ike reroutes his guys, and they march down this same strip. I don't know if it's along the Seine or what, but it's a big show of force. Immediately after that, you get DC and London that both accept this free French rule in Paris again. And at this point in time, if there was ever any question about the Vichy government working with the Germans had rounded up everybody that was like top brass in the Vichy government and had brought them down to Germany and basically put them in like this fortress. It was like they called it to protect them, but it was more like a jail because they didn't really get to go outside of it. And so they were basically holding this French Vichy government hostage while being like, no, they're still legitimate. And all the guys that were a part of that government were like, God, the Germans need to get back in there. Like we kind of pot committed with these guys and now they're on the ropes. They might need to pull out a secret weapon to put us back in there or else we're going to look really, really bad.
They made their fucking bed.
Yeah, no, they absolutely did. They're a victim of their own demise at that point.
So August 29th, he gets the United States to recognize the Free French, basically forces as the de facto government of France. And, at that point too, that's got to be, okay, so the show of force of them going into Paris with that, if you see that, and, okay, so you saw Paris fall to the Germans, you just saw Paris retaken. Still at the same time, Paris can still then be counterattacked because you saw what the Germans did the first time.
Yeah.
By them holding Paris, but then also showing like, oh shit, it's not just the French who are actually going to stay here in Paris and be like here to fight. The allies, the rest of the allies are here. That's got to also bolster like the resistance numbers of people being like, yeah, let's fucking fight now. So then you're getting more resistance and more people joining up to actually like probably like help out and like push the Germans out.
Well, to the Allies side, Roosevelt, again, probably pretty wary of de Gaulle, wanted to put an Allied occupation force in France. And immediately de Gaulle says, there's no way that's ever going to happen. And he's like, again, you're outranked here. I'm FDR. This is going to happen. Ike steps in and is like, just let him be. We kind of got things going in the right direction here. It's going to be less of a fight if you just let it happen. And after this is stopped from happening, later on in de Gaulle's memoirs, he claims that he was actually the one that talked Roosevelt out of doing it.
Yeah. And I think I can't wait to do Eisenhower. I think Ike was very smart in a lot of different respects, but I think being there and being a general and actually seeing and probably going into areas that had been bombed and things like that, or areas that had been liberated, and kind of seeing what was going on and having that foresight been like, we're going to have to help clean this up. Like anything that we do here is going to we need to make this cleanup as easy as possible to get this back up, because also at the same time, the world economy is at stake, all of that kind of stuff.
For sure.
And so him looking at that situation and FDR being like, yeah, they need to be under, I think they called it AMGOT or something like that.
Yeah, there was a weird acronym.
Yeah. And FDR was like, yeah, they need to be under like our basically like stewardship while we help them rebuild. Ike is like, no, listen, we're going to have our hands full with so much of this other shit. Like, we also need to stay friendly. We don't need any type of conflict. I also know maybe kind of what type of guy this is. And for now, let's go ahead and keep this guy on our side until France can kind of get itself into maybe like a better position even.
Oh, also, the job wasn't done.
Yeah.
Hitler was still running amok, not to the extent that he was. And we have Benito that's out of the fighting. And I want to say that we've made the turn in Japan, but there's still missions to be completed. Not to mention France is still going to come out of this as a semi-world power who has the ability to maybe start rebuilding themselves. They'll still need Marshall Plan help afterwards, but that's in the future.
Yeah.
We got bigger fish to fry. He seems like he's going to be on top of it. He's getting a great reception, and not to mention receptions.
This is also the way it's leaning.
Yeah.
Like what? We have to pick a horse in this race. And this is which way it's going to lean. What are you going to keep recognizing the Vichy, or are you just not going to recognize anyone? Like, get on the fucking train because it's heading down the tracks.
Yeah. November 10th, Churchill actually flies into Paris and is received by De Gaulle and just this massive cheering Frenchmen that are just raining down this praise on Churchill. And I guess they said that out of the entire time he was there, the only time that he wasn't crying is when there wasn't like a crowd adoring him around there. Like he felt every single thing that he had felt probably over that entire war. Just at that moment, hearing those cheers, he's probably like, I love that we did it for my people at home, but now I understand how important it was to do this for France.
All you motherfuckers owe me.
Yeah. That probably some of that too.
But think of what that did to also solidify De Gaulle as the guy.
Yeah.
Like he's receiving Churchill in liberated Paris and everything. That's almost like a recognition of saying like, well, the prime minister wouldn't meet with anybody but like the head of our state. And like, it's De Gaulle, right? That's the guy. So
he was a hardo too. Because did you read that when he came back, he refused to stay in any of the like French presidential palaces, and he continued to still work out of his old office that he had in like the Army of Defense's building. Like he didn't want to almost like call his own shot and step into that until they asked him to. You gotta stay a man of the people.
You gotta stay the man of the resistance. You can't put yourself above that. They've just seen so many people living like that.
Well, maybe we missed that and need to go back and do a fiver on it. But how did he kind of form this resistance in France during this whole entire thing?
Okay, so what was the guy's name?
It was Jean
Moulin.
Yeah.
Last name was Moulin.
Yeah, Jean Moulin.
Jean Moulin was if De Gaulle was the guy in the chair. For those of you that don't know, it's a comic book reference. The guy in the chair is the person that kind of like if Batman was out and about, Alfred is the guy in the chair. It's the guy sitting back helping him at headquarters. I feel like this was a situation where De Gaulle was like the guy in the chair and Moulin was the guy that was fucking getting airdropped and parachuted into France, meeting with these resistance group, arranging arms exchange to get them armed and everything, getting out of France multiple times, airdropping in again. This guy was basically the man on the ground that was kind of pulling this whole thing together. De Gaulle was the figurehead. He was the guy that was good on the mic and the guy that had kind of like built them the support base. But the guy that was down there, kind of like De Gaulle's FDR, Ike is this Moulin guy.
It was a shot caller, first lieutenant type situation for sure.
And so this guy ends up doing this for like 2 years before he's finally captured by the Gestapo.
Don't know how. That'll definitely be an episode that we do on this guy because it's just a wild story. There was somehow a leak after years of success in keeping his identity secret. Something happens and they end up getting caught. And it goes real bad because this guy named Klaus Barbie, who was the head of the Gestapo, just tortures the living shit out of him.
All right, let's save it for that other one.
Yeah, well, just a quick finish with that. Not only does he torture him, he then puts him on display while he's in a coma for everybody else that they're trying to torture for information.
Yeah.
So, like, the mind games are incredible. But without this guy single-handedly putting himself on the line to go over and form these resistance groups, there is no real way to get SOE and OSS members over into mainland Europe to be able to start creating these systems of, they're not rat lines, what are the good ones?
Oh, cells or
Safe lines?
sure.
It was another kind of line. But the good lines that you want, not
The
the
good
rat
lines.
lines. You're not trying to save the rats in this situation. But he was the guy that made the French resistance into the French resistance. It was the what was it? CNR
Yeah.
was the Central National Resistance, or what I believe that's what it stands for. It's got to be something in French. But he single-handedly kind of created this for De Gaulle. De Gaulle, like you said, was the front man. He was the face of this. He was the one that was banging the resistance drum, while you had Moulin over there just basically being like, that's the guy that's in charge of what I'm doing over here.
Yeah. So we end up getting to kind of the phase of the war. There were several conferences that took place during World War II in which like Stalin and Churchill and FDR would meet up and they'd kind of discuss
Hilarious.
kind of the big picture stuff of the war. They would see where things had progressed to, and then they would have different alternatives that they would discuss in case of different scenarios. De Gaulle was not invited to these. And this fucking really stuck with De Gaulle because he felt that as the recognized leader of Free France, that he was on the same level as FDR, Churchill, and Stalin and should have a hand in knowing what's going on. This guy wasn't even informed really about certain aspects of operations, or didn't want to, like, certain guys didn't want to let him in on aspects of operations. D-Day was when I think they had to kind of like, they needed the French resistance to do all this kind of stuff. They knew he had the best communication, methods with them. So I think he had to be lit in on that. But big picture stuff about how stuff may be like partitioned up, he wasn't privy to it. And he's sour about this, and you can kind of tell.
But why? The reason that they don't inform him on shit is because French codes are notoriously easily broken.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it's the reason that they're not telling him this stuff is because they know that he's going to be the weak link to get most of these plans foiled. Mm-hmm. And when you talk about Yalta and Potsdam, I understand that he was a part of it. I understand that I didn't understand that he was a part of World War II until we looked into him and how big of a figure that he was. But at the same time, you gotta have the major players making these decisions, and you also have to have the major players who sort of have a general interest in this whole Allied front, instead of one guy being like, we all don't need to come out on the better end of this. France needs to come out on the better end of this.
So 1945 rolls around. May. German army surrenders to the American and Brits at Reims. Now, when they surrendered to the Americans and the British, that didn't include the French, so they had technically not surrendered with the French. They actually had a separate armistice with the French that were actually signed in Berlin. So, it wasn't even like that all of them were in there as like the Allied surrender. I guess that also, like, is that just the Germans being like, we don't recognize this? Like sour grapes?
I think it was more of the angle of De Gaulle, where it's like when we talked about during the Opium Wars and about how Great Britain was kind of the driver, and then everybody lined up to sign a treaty with China afterwards to let them in. I think after everything happened, France like walked up to the table and Germany's like, what are you doing here by yourself? Like, we already signed with everybody else. Let's put pen to paper with us too. And they're probably just like, okay, sure, I guess we'll sign it with you too.
Like, we want our own separate shit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, that's all just stationing and positioning. And this,
I think that's a power move too.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you made France surrender directly, then you're going to sign the armistice with France directly. It's not going to be a group project where it's like you get a third of the credit, you get a third of No, this is the separate one that you're declaring that you're surrendering to us.
Plus, we talked about this perfect case in point during the Berlin Wall episode, when they were talking about occupying Germany again, Stalin's like, France doesn't get shit. And they're like, no. The U.S. and Great Britain are like, we're going to split this up quarter. Stalin goes, no, we're going to split this up 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And France's part's coming out of your guys' 2/3. It's not coming out of my shit. And this is just another chess game of this positioning where Stalin knows that if he's got two other people to contend with, it's going to suck. Why add a third? Why try to put France in there too? But De Gaulle just keeps nudging his way in and just keeps pushing and pushing.
And how good does that look to everybody to be like, they surrendered directly or they did the armistice directly with us?
And he also ends up coming out in a major way because he gets invited to the establishment of the UN, which means that he gets assured, or France gets assured. I keep saying he and France because they kind of feel like they're the same thing. But that assures France a permanent seat.
That was, I think, in his head, he's like, I am France.
Yeah.
I am France.
He assures them a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. So he gets that veto for anything that goes on in the world that needs to be brought in front of the Security Council.
They're not gypped on this shit.
No.
Despite little petty shit, like he refused British participation in the Paris Victory Parade.
Hilarious.
The one exclusion was an ambulance that had it was an ambulance company or service that had French doctors with British nurses. And what ended up happening is like one of the nurses was the wife of the guy that actually flew him out of France in the first place over to England.
Nice.
But he had a problem with that.
You think he tried on one of their outfits just for old time's sake?
I think he was jealous. He's like, those fit so fucking good. That's how they're supposed to fit. French troops are actually sent to occupy French-speaking Italian border, a border region of Val d'Aosta. And again, this is in 45. Like, as soon as this happens, it's not like, hey, take a breath. It's like, we're going to go ahead and make sure we're like grabbing up the shit that we want to grab up.
Just like Russia wanted to be the first one into Germany, France wanted to be the first one into anywhere else that they could get.
Anything that was like touching them that they could be like, oh, no, this is, and like, it's like the little thing where you just like reach a little bit over and scoop a little bit. It's like, no, we're not going like a big one. It's just like, we're just carving off a little piece.
Calm down, buddy. Let's wrap this thing up before we start trying to cut stuff up.
Well, and as they're going in there, because they're still occupying forces in like Italy and, you know, occupied U.S. troops, things like that, the commander of this like French force ends up threatening to fire on American troops if they interfere with the fucking French getting down to this area. And Truman is fucking pissed. He's like, what the fuck, dude? He's like, we literally just helped you take your country back. We have people stationed in the areas that were like from the Axis, and you're marching your troops in and threatening to fire on American troops if they stop you. Like, this is not how you fucking repay somebody.
No, but I don't think there was ever a point in his mind where he felt like he owed America or Great Britain anything.
Never felt like he was like the little kid at the table or like the little,
And we'll see. He's a very petty individual. And that's sort of part of me that I know that he bugged everybody so much to the nth degree, but he was just kind of undeniable. Like, you got to respect a guy that can just spit in everybody's faces and not realize what he's doing. He's annoying.
I think he kind of knew what he was doing in some of those situations.
But I think some of them were just kind of social cues. Him coming back into France eventually, or kind of one of the first things he did. One of the first things that he did was, again, he went on this PR tour and he flies over into Russia to meet Stalin. Stalin couldn't have been less enthused to meet him, and then just didn't listen to him the entire time he was there. Which Stalin probably hung up a lot of the time on Churchill and Roosevelt. So meeting this guy, he's probably like, what are you doing here?
He's like, 6 weeks? You guys lasted 6 weeks. He's like, are you kidding me? It's like, do you know how many of our people are dead and we still were able to win?
You guys couldn't even hold up for a full 2 months. The Gaull's probably like, man, quit bringing up old shit. Let's try to forge something new.
Well, there are clashes in Syria, which are French against British forces. And basically the British are like, no, get the fuck out of here. And because of that, fucking De Gaulle is like, you betrayed France, betrayed the West, and this cannot be forgiven or forgotten.
Okay. Cool, man. You know
He's
what
like-
else can't be forgotten?
The fact that you are only sitting in this position because we fucking got you in this position, dude. Like, stop biting the fucking hand. You're also part of the Marshall Plan, are you not?
Uh-huh. I think early on in our research when I texted you, I was like, I feel like they're taking a hell of a lot of credit for shit that you didn't do. And you're like, yeah, but how do you feel about the way that we feel about World War II in the U.S., where it's like we probably take a little bit more credit than we deserve?
Mm-hmm.
It's very similar to what France is doing.
De
But
Gaulle was there, though.
yeah.
Like, he knew exactly what they were doing, and
Yep.
he still thought that. So October of 1945 rolls around, and there's basically an election to determine who's going to draft the new constitution. So the Third Republic is done. They're going to draft a new
The Vichy sympathizers.
Yes. There were some... The term legal purges is probably a decent one to describe it, but
Clinical.
basically you had political purges. You had the people that were running the Vichy government that were essentially being controlled by the Nazis and cooperating with them, and you now had the new established and recognized Free French government, or we'll just call it the French government now. Some chickens had to come home to roost.
There was a few sentenced to death and absentias that needed to be repaid.
Correct. Yeah. So the 2,000 people received the death penalty. 800 of those actually were executed. Other people had either life imprisonment, sentences commuted. There had to be essentially a show of reprisal. One of the people that ends up getting his...
What did we not mention about the Vichy? Who was the leader of the Vichy?
Wingard, or...
No.
Oh, Pétain.
Pétain.
So, yeah. So Pétain was... yeah.
He was drafted to be the leader of the Vichy government when it first kicked off. So, unfortunately, we didn't mention that when it happens, but this just continues this 15 years of working under Pétain to now being completely on the other side of everything from Pétain.
It's so fucking crazy full circle, dude. Like,
Yeah.
that these guys just happened to, like, that was his first guy that he learned from. It's fucking like Shakespearean a little bit.
Oh, very much so, yes.
But it's crazy. So he was not one of the 800. He actually had his death penalty commuted to life.
Life
And at
in
that
prison.
point, he was old as fuck.
Yes, he was.
So it wasn't very long.
And there was still this little bit, I don't remember if it was a memoir or something like that, but when Pétain ends up kicking the bucket in prison, there's somebody, I think we might mention him his name's like Barbarou or something. It's a fun name that we'll mention at the end. Comes to him and he goes, Pétain is dead. De Gaulle sits there and thinks about it for a second, and he looks at him and he goes, Marshal Pétain is dead. Like, he still has enough respect for him that he wants to speak his rank. Like a regular average citizen shouldn't just be calling him Pétain. Like, he demanded enough of how De Gaulle felt about him that he wanted to make sure to know, like, he was a marshal. He did a lot of good for this country before he did a whole lot of bad.
Yeah.
And this is a spin during these trials that they had that the Vichy use. And I think, kind of from what I heard, the far right government, or the far right, I guess,
The directions
Party?
mean different things depending on what area you're talking about,
Yeah.
and what country, yeah.
but the far right party in France has kind of latched onto that the Vichy government wasn't as complicit with the Germans as the stories made out to be. And this is where they start to shape it. And this, I think, is a major issue because during the Tokyo trials that we just kind of learned about, that was the world basically putting Japanese people on trial.
Yeah.
In the Nuremberg trials, you had the world putting Nazis on trial.
Mhm.
In France, you had the French putting the French on trial.
Yeah.
And a couple months removed from this big issue, I think that there was a lot of looking at it and being like, oh, we should have sat on this maybe for a little bit longer before
Yeah.
we tried to attempt it, because those are very serious charges to levy against other Frenchmen.
And they happen pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Like, they're not really beating around the bush on it.
We don't even wait a year. It's like months afterwards that this happens.
Yep. All right. we're going a little long on this one. We're going to take another bathroom break.
Okay.
See you in a sec. All right, so we come to 45 and the elections to, like I said, determine who is going to draft the new constitution. So they're basically like, we need to elect the guys who are going to write the shit that we're going to live by. And De Gaulle, being in the position that he is, there's not really been anything, it hasn't been set in stone for an official position. He's just kind of the figurehead that during this time of kind of like quick reconstruction, trying to get everybody on the same fucking wavelength, you're just the guy that got you to this point is the guy that you're going to turn to at this point.
Well, as Chris had mentioned before we went on the last bathroom break, they're writing the Constitution for the Fourth Republic of France. Mm-hmm. And the reason that we're on the Fourth Republic of France is because they've had 3 other republics that they've just dissolved because they didn't work. And that's what I was talking about earlier and that we talked about was France politically was just the biggest wild card ever. They'd already had to redo things. Now they're on their 4th time, and we still have 1 more time to go after that.
That does sound weird, but then when you also think about, like, we're not that old.
Yeah.
And I don't know how long the French Republics lasted, but, like, there could have been, like, a French Republic prior to Napoleon or something that lasted for 300 years.
I think he was the
ones were
first.
just short. Let's not call our shot. Let's not.
Yeah. I'm just saying maybe it seems weird for us because they've had this many republics that fast and we like hold sacred to making sure that the Constitution can't be changed.
You actually do have to kind of like be like, oh shit, like something's not working and you guys will just kind of try to figure out like you guys have obviously kind of made it work.
Yeah.
And written a new constitution. And I realize it looks chaotic, but I mean, it can be done. And if it can be done, it can be improved upon. So, like, you got to kind of admire that aspect of being like, oh, yeah, we can just, if this shit's not working, we just draft some new stuff.
There's enough U.S. pride in me to be like, well, we got it right better the first time, so it's taken that long. But we could use a refresher.
Yeah. There is certain things have happened within the world that maybe would warrant taking a look at some stuff. So with this, De Gaulle is like, well, if we're going to do a new constitution, I definitely want a strong executive office. We definitely need to have that. And the 3 main parties at the time were like, yeah, so we're thinking of like severe restrictions for like the presidential power because we've kind of had that before and it didn't really work out with the World War and the army and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, of course, you're going to go ahead and come together. You're going to try to figure this out. And De Gaulle's just going to do what De Gaulle wants to do because November 13th, 1945, he ends up winning a unanimous election to the head of government. And at that point, he's like, oh, and by the way, I will be unwilling to allow any communist any important ministry roles, despite the communists, weirdly enough, having the largest party. So he's already being like, so now I got the votes. Now let me see who I'm going to motherfuck.
Well, I don't know. There's just so much old bias about not understanding more about communists than I do now.
Here's my point though. That could have been any other large political party.
Yeah.
And to me, that would be the same. I was simply just stating that it happened to be the Communist Party. I'm not pointing out that like, oh, because they're communist, you did that. That's fine. That's something kind of weird. You just saw what Russia's doing. You don't like that direction for your country because you're trying to figure shit out. I get that. Well, I'm just saying because it's the largest party and the fact you're like, none of the people who have the largest representation are going to get any of these positions. That's what I think is kind of dicey.
You also need to know that you have a strong currency in your country. And capitalism is going to provide you the strongest currency in your country. And if you have a majority communists in your cabinet, A, it's always going to be a fight. But B, at the same time, you're allowing that foothold that everybody coming out of World War II entering this Cold War period is scared of.
Yeah.
Like it's
the new boogeyman.
It's a major factor because, you know, even though we're only so far removed from World War II, there's still some tensions going on trying to hammer out occupation deals with Russia and everything else.
And it's not just the boogeyman. It's the boogeyman that's in our house.
Yeah, that's pretty close to their central base. Like I can definitely understand it. Do I think that it's kind of crazy that he did it? Yeah. Did I think that it was kind of crazier that I told you the communists still hold like 8 seats in France today? Yeah. That's pretty surprising to me. It's not shocking, and actually it's almost more of like okay, you guys will at least let these ideologies play themselves out.
I'm not gonna lie. If you want to get rid of like bipartisanship, it would be so fast. All you would have to do is you would just have to like give a little sliver to like the Communist Party and just put them right in between the Democrats and the Republicans, and they would just be like, fuck you. And then they would see the Republicans saying the same thing to them. Like, you don't like these guys either? And they're like, we don't like them either. They're like, let's get together and talk.
That's what it is. In the United States, we figured out that we need to just attack the enemy within when it comes to politics. So if you just introduce a new enemy, and I'm not calling Bernie an enemy because I actually like the guy and I think he had some pretty solid ideas, but if you let 15 Bernies into the government here, there would be such a strong movement to be like, we got to figure this shit out. These guys have a foothold.
It would be like the equivalent of if like people found out that aliens were real and they came to attack us. Like, the whole world would just be like, everyone put the fucking fighting on pause. We got the aliens. It would kind of have that effect.
Yeah. And again, I'm not advocating for communism in the United States, but at the same time,
I'm just saying it ain't working right now. And maybe try, throwing a wild card.
Yeah, let's get a weapon in there to try to bring everybody together.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what everybody always talks about, is trying to bring the United States together. I don't think anything brought the United States together faster than knowing that communism might be around the corner.
It's true.
Like, instead of accusing each other of communism and fascism.
Nazis.
Yeah.
And then communists.
Yes.
So like, yeah, we were together for a long time there.
Mm-hmm. We had a common enemy outside of our borders, and then after we vanquished them, we turned on ourselves.
We need fucking aliens to show us what an actual problem looks like.
For the record, in case they're listening, pro-alien.
Yeah. So you get this pushback against De Gaulle, basically trying to kind of limit his powers and kind of pointing to light that he's not really playing like they want to with these like assignments and everything. So he's like, you know what? Fuck it. I quit. I'm going to quit if you guys don't let me do what I want to do. And so they're like, well, hold on. Okay, we'll give you what you want to do, but you just can't leave. Shit's just barely holding together right now. We get it. The communists are scary, so don't leave. Do what you want. So he ends up finalizing his cabinet on November 21st, and communists received 5 of 22 ministries. So he did kind of actually give in a little bit, but when you factor in it was the largest party, you'd think it was have the largest representation. He's like, nah, 5 is all you get.
Well, not to mention, I don't think there was any way that he could, in that position, keep them out.
They're going to be the 5 least communist of you.
Yeah.
And they're also going to be in the 5 least important ministries. I just want that to be known.
There also is something to the thought of being like, even though you don't want them in there, if you want to curry favor with the majority of people, if they have the most people going, like maybe not the worst idea to at least throw them a bone.
And this is just like a common occurrence. It's his power play, because he's basically refusing this kind of a rules by compromise situation when he's making these decisions. He's not really recognizing that there's people with differing opinions that need different things. It's just basically like, no, this is De Gaulle's vision. This is what I see as France. Mm-hmm. And if you're not on board, then you need to kind of get the fuck out of the way and you're not going to be part of it. And so when he gets pushback on that as well, he threatens to resign again. And they're like, no, God, okay, please don't resign. Like, what do we need to do to try to keep you here besides like the crazy kind of unreasonable shit that you're asking? So eventually, the day does come in 1946. So basically, like a year later, or it's not even a year later, it's on January 20th. He's finally like, you know what? No, I'm resigning. And they're like, fine. He's like, what? They're like, fine, do it. Fuck it. Get out. And he basically, keeps using this as a power play to try to get back power. And he's like, you know what? Fine. I'm going home, and when all this shit falls apart, you're going to be begging me to come back. And when I come back, you're going to give me more than I want.
He's just dragging his desk down the hallway, trying to give them as much time as possible to change their minds.
But yeah, apparently, even by January 20th of 1946, De Gaulle was not as indispensable as he was in wartime. And we kind of talked about this, where kind of comparing him to Churchill in that way, where he was the right guy to be in that situation to liberate France and to make that happen. But that doesn't make you the right guy when those scenarios are no longer applicable and your goal completely changes from taking back a country to actually running the country, where you actually have to think about the people that are on war footing and just be begging to be set free and be liberated. Now people are like, well, now we need shit. Like we need this to actually run efficiently and like help us live.
What do you know about the economy, military man? Like there's a big mistake that he makes, and I don't even think it was something that it was like a self-inflicted wound, but he kind of is thrust from a military role into a political role. And you had a guy that was leading this resistance and did so well.
He thrust himself.
Yeah, he did, for sure.
He thrust himself so hard into that role.
But once you find yourself on the other thing that you were good at and you get back home and people want to hear like your vision for the country or your beliefs or kind of your political system and how you want to form your own party, if they were just pumped that you were the liberator, that's great. And then they hear your politics and they're like, oh shit, you're not going to work out too well in this position. If you can't gain any favor, if you can't kind of create your own cult of personality within politics, you're probably not long for that world, because you're not going to have people. You're going to have three other parties pushing against you that aren't on your side. Like if you don't have that political capital coming into it, you're not going to be able to harvest it in just basically a year or two after that happened. You need time to try to build a base.
And what's nuts is kind of how this ties into a lot of things that we like learn about, but we don't learn how they came about. Because after he ends up resigning, he's like, okay, you know what? I'm going to take time away. I'm going to do my thing that all men do when they get older. I'm going to write my memoirs. But I'm also going to go ahead and keep my toe in the political pool. So I know what's going on. I know kind of like who's in what position and everything. And all of a sudden this situation comes up. I wrote this as the title. I thought it was funny time. Big Trouble in Indochina.
Did you know that, or did you hear at least, that in parts of his memoirs he goes into the third person?
Yes, I think that's why I said De Gaulle is going to De Gaulle, yeah. I want to say like that's what he would say to himself in the mirror when he was getting pushed back. He's like, De Gaulle going to De Gaulle? Because wouldn't that be, what does De Gaulle mean again? France? Gaulle? France?
Yeah.
So France is going to France? Is that? Yeah.
Pretty much.
That's why he would repeat, I am France.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Big Trouble in Indochina, which includes modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Now, in World War II, Japan actually took it. So in 1940, it had been taken by Japan because it's much closer to Japan than it is to France. And de Gaulle had actually sent French agents and like arms and supplies and stuff like that to actually help push them out of that area, while at the same times that the Allies were also attacking. So to try to kind of like cause local unrest and kind of like a guerrilla force to make their recapture of the island easier. And that was in late 40 and 45.
This is kind of like a Crusades type deal where they're like, okay, you need to go back and liberate this part that we lost, but just understand anything that you guys liberate comes back to us, right?
Yeah. So this is actually where we lead into the communist Viet Minh? And they are led by Ho Chi Minh, who basically is kind of funding this independence campaign because they're like, okay, we were under French rule, then we were under Japanese rule. Now they're trying to make us under French rule again. This would be the time that we need if we want, you know, Vietnamese independence. This is the time we need to do it. We can't let the French get a foothold in here. So you get Ho Chi Minh, who is leading the independence campaign, and that kind of starts in, I think, 1946. So, I mean, they literally just out of World War II coming in, and they're like, okay, and now is the time. So de Gaulle was dealing with this and is like, all right, well, that's something that I'd actually taken back and everything like that. And what does the French government do? And again, de Gaulle's not in at this point and everything, but they kind of have to start dealing with some of these de Gaulle decisions, basically. And this leads into the First Indochina War, which was December 19th, 1946, all the way to July 21st, 1954. And the reason that it ended in 1954 is that led us into a little something called the Vietnam War.
Oh, buddy, just hearing you say it, it perks my ears. We're going to be talking about this again. We're going to be talking about this at the beginning of a series.
Yes. So 1947, he's like, okay, well, it doesn't look like they're kind of handling the whole. He sees these opportunities of weakness, I think, in like the current government, where his strength is something that people will look at and be like, yep, he could fix this situation. So he sees this happening in Indochina, and he actually is like, okay, I'm going to start my own political party. And I'm just going to try to kind of like slowly slide myself in here and kind of test the waters to see how warm the reception would be if there was a De Gaulleist political party.
You need a sharp name, though. You need something that the people are going to remember.
Something that makes them remember what I did.
Yeah, well, and at the same time, too, you kind of want to have maybe a draw for them in there. So you create the Rally of the French People Party. Great name.
What did I do? I rallied the French people. When you think of who rallied them, you think De Gaulle.
This is how I know that he didn't have a lot of other guys on his side, this was the name of the party. There wasn't a whole lot of checks and balances in making these decisions.
Rally all for De Gaulle. That wouldn't rhyme in French, so
not a chance.
There was probably a really cool slogan that like actually rhymed in France. French.
Whenever we do these foreign episodes, I just always assume that everything is in English.
I thought you were going to say 4-hour episodes, and then I looked at the clock and we're like at 2:50. So yeah, you guys are in for a long one again.
But anytime we're doing a foreign episode, I'm like, they all spoke to each other in English, right?
You've done this. The last long episodes have been your doing.
Why? The Crusades weren't just me.
Oh, that's right. I had a hand in that.
Yeah.
Damn it.
Yeah, no, I'll take credit for De Gaulle because I think De Gaulle deserves it.
This is fun as shit.
Yeah, and it's going to be nuts that De Gaulle is going to be a longer episode than Mussolini was. But at the same time.
So what's crazy to me is, yes, he does go ahead and lead the movement to liberate France, but he's literally only the leader of France for like maybe 6 to 8 months. Not even that. So sorry, I'm looking at my dates here. He gets elected November 13th and actually resigns on January 20th. So fuck, like
2 months later.
And he steps away for a while until 1958 rolls around. Do you have anything before 1958?
No, just this party that he kind of creates, this Rally of the French People, actually started off kind of hot. They claimed quite a few seats in Parliament, but there wasn't like a trying to continue to grow the campaign and trying to continue to grow the party, and the support for it kind of falls on deaf ears. Again, partially because there's not a whole lot else going on besides something overseas. Like, we have the Marshall Plan, kind of the idea of rebuilding. Not to mention, it's also very important because that's what everybody in France is focused on, is like, we put ourselves back together sort of after World War I. Now we're trying to make up for World War II. Maybe let's not rock the boat. This guy plays well with Parliament. Maybe it's okay.
The other thing, too, is he's not active. He's not coming out and like leading this party, like actively and campaigning and being like, I'm forming this party because I'm seeking re-election or anything like that. He's not doing that. He's just using it to kind of almost to gauge interest, to see how much power, maybe just the fact that this party is like supported by him, how many seats it can gain. And then he's like, okay, I think I could actually make a run at this if there's enough support here. I just need something to happen to maybe like, stir the shit a little bit to where people are like, who handles situations like this really well is Charles de Gaulle. So luckily enough, we get this thing in 1958.
Just before we get into it, I self-report here. Chris flipped me on this theory that he's going to put forward, maybe faster before the episode. Like, we're talking about within 20 minutes before we started recording, I was pretty sure that this didn't happen. Chris flipped me within 20 minutes.
I Charlie Kelly'd the fuck out of him. So 1958, it's called the May Crisis. And
I'm sure the Algerians would like you to call it the Algerian Battle for Independence.
Correct. Sorry about that. Yes, it's the Algerian Battle for Independence. So I titled this one Big Trouble in Algeria. It doesn't have the same ring to it. But you basically have the French Algerian nationals. So France has held Algeria for, I think you said
1870.
1870. So we're sitting here at 1958. So that leaves you like maybe 2 or 3 generations. You have people that live in Algeria, French people that have like raised families, and like there's been populations that are going down there. So you actually have a presence of like French Algerians, and then you have like a military presence down there because, of course, they have to keep their shit locked down in Africa. Why wouldn't why shouldn't they be there? And
they're considered a part of France,
Yes.
as opposed to a colonial part of France.
like a Indochina.
Yes.
It's actually considered because hey, it's just right across the Mediterranean, right?
Yeah, well, and they had held it for so long where like their other colonies in equatorial Africa have just been looked at as like, we already got you, or we got you guys later on.
Yeah.
But Algiers is just us.
So they support De Gaulle. And basically, kind of this crisis, what ends up happening is you have the Algerian Liberation Movement, or I'm trying to remember, the FLN, or FLN.
Yes.
And then you have the French government. Then you have this, I'm trying to remember what they actually called themselves.
The Pied Noir?
The Pied Noir. And they were the French Algerian nationals. Well, you had this guy, General Jacques Massou, who actually led an uprising of these Pied Noir, took over the government in Algeria from the French government. And then you'd think, okay, so they're just trying to fight against and the reason they did that is their excuse was the French government wasn't doing enough against the Algerian liberation movement.
The FLN.
Yeah, the FLN. They weren't fighting them hard enough. So we're going to actually, because we're the people that live here, we're going to take this over and we're actually going to go ahead and fight this. But they don't. They go and invade and take Corsica. They drop paratroopers into Corsica because they have military assets because they were used to fight back in World War II and everything, and it's their territory. They actually take Corsica, and all of a sudden, there's this panic in Paris of like, okay, we're hearing some rumblings that they're maybe planning to drop paratroopers in here to try to actually take Paris and take the capital.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of a sudden, De Gaulle is getting interviewed about this. And they're asking him, of course, the questions are going to be like, if they asked you to come back to handle this, how would you handle it? Would you be willing? And basically his message was that I'm at the disposal of the country. And if they want me, they can have me. If they call me, I'll step up I will do it for France. Like if I'm called upon, I will do it for France. And there were some concerns about kind of based on some of your stuff before, some people have accused you of maybe trying to be a little bit of a dictator. And he's like, listen, I'm 67 years old. He's like, why at 67 would I start being a dictator? And that's something a fucking dictator would say. That's something somebody who's trying to become a dictator would say. You don't use your age as an excuse. There have been old dictators. So, of course, what ends up happening, the 29th French president addresses Parliament.
Do you have his quote?
I do not. Do you have
I got his quote.
Okay. This is how he addresses Parliament in regard to bringing in De Gaulle, correct?
Yeah, this is one of the most punched up, sexy French things. Turning towards the most illustrious of Frenchmen, towards the man who, in the darkest years of our history, was our chief for the reconquest of freedom, who refused dictatorship, in order to reestablish the Republic. I asked General de Gaulle to confer with the head of state and to examine with him what in the framework of the Republican legality is necessary for the immediate formation of a government of national safety, what can be done in a fairly short time for a deep reform of our institutions.
He's basically going and saying, help us, Daddy.
He's cradling the balls while he's working the pipe is what he's doing.
Swallow the gravy.
You're telling me he was... in our darkest years of our history, he was our chief for the reconquest of freedom. Holy shit, dude.
I don't know when he turned down being when he would have been able to become a dictator. He wasn't in there fucking long enough.
No, and he quit,
yes.
Which is not a very
because they were finally just fine, you're not going to be a dictator. Fucking quit.
Yeah.
Quit asking for more power. Well, of course, exactly what you would think is going to happen. So De Gaulle ends up coming back and he's like, but I'm going to come back and we're going to draft a new constitution because this Fourth Republic shit, it ain't working out. I know lemon when I see it. I know it's brand new. We're just going to smother it in the crib. We're getting rid of it. I'm going to drop a new one. And in this new one, we're going to go ahead and make these presidents 7-year terms. I, of course, obviously will be the first. And what I'm going to need is this president's going to have a lot of power, a lot of authority. What I'm also going to need is I'm going to need even more authority, like emergency powers type stuff for like the first 6 months, because I got to turn this thing around quickly.
Yeah.
This isn't, I got to try to, we're heading for the rocks and I got to try to steer the boat.
You called, I answered.
Mm-hmm. This is my price. Will you pay it? And they're like, yeah, it kind of sounds like you're asking to be made king, but you know what? Fuck it. June 1st, De Gaulle made prime minister. He's back.
I kind of like it until you start putting the pieces together.
Okay. So this guy, Masu, is that how? Yeah.
Masu.
Yeah. So this guy served when he was in World War II. He served in like the armored divisions. So chances are there was possibly some crossover between him and De Gaulle as far as like building up a relationship. He also served in Algeria.
Yes.
So there was probably some relationship building with this guy. And for some reason, this guy, like I get the sell of the point of this previous French general leading this, rebellious faction of like French Algerian guys against the French government, using the excuse of like the French government isn't doing enough. We're the ones here fighting this on the ground. Again, not saying like Algeria should have had its independence. It's a completely separate country, but you guys aren't doing enough because you guys aren't here. So we're just going to go and take it. But then to be like, okay, but then why are you guys coming up to Corsica? And then why are you kind of like planning on dropping paratroopers on Paris? It doesn't make any sense. Why would you just like expend all your resources when you said the whole reason that this whole thing isn't going well in Algeria is because they weren't doing enough down there? All of a sudden you get this guy coming and basically De Gaulle sitting back and being like, okay, well, this kind of seems like the thing that would probably get me back into power, but I'm going to slow play this. Let them come to me because I told them that the only reason I would come back is if I had more power.
Before Chris continues, this is pure conjecture on our part.
Yes, but I mean, it's not hard to connect these. This isn't like tinfoil hat stuff. This is
it's still technically a conspiracy.
Okay. After he ends up getting elected, you would think that he got elected in order to prevent this civil war against this like rogue faction of like these French Algerians. The guy, Masu, isn't like jailed or prisoned for leading this essential coup because it's a coup within a coup. It's like it's a turducken, but only two. So I'm going to try to say this without sounding like a crazy person. So Masu is actually taken like out of, apparently he had a position within Algeria and everything. He was taken out of that, but then he was given essentially like watch over 5 other regions in France. So and he was actually promoted. So instead of actually the guy that was leading the revolt, that's the reason you were called into office to put down, you don't do anything to him. You actually go ahead and bring him back home and give him basically 5 regions of France to look over.
I'm not seeing any conspiracy there. That all lines up.
Does it?
Well, like I say, I'm on your side. You pitched me a good argument here. But before we finish the end of that conspiracy, what would lead you to believe, based on his next move, that it was a coup or not?
Okay. So his next move to actually end the whole thing in Algeria is to essentially just be like, Algeria, have your independence.
Well, so in a way, just to ease into what he's talking about with this is the French president declares that France is on the brink of the civil war. As Chris said, De Gaulle comes in, he accepts his terms. He's commissioned a new constitution for the Fifth Republic now. I heard a lot in research that he was the one that came up with the new constitution. He was actually the one that commissioned it and then kind of put his elements into it while somebody else wrote it. In this new constitution, for it to be ratified, basically the new constitution would grant freedom from France for all of its colonies. So it's like he's realized that they've come far enough to 1958 with this imperial France, and maybe it's time to start pushing away from that.
He's so focused on France and restoring like the luster of France and that spirit of France that he's just like, you know what? Everything we have, we're going to pull back in and we're going to make France what I believe that France should be. And in doing so, part of that, like Adam was saying, is the Constitution providing essential independence for all the colonies. He was also like, I'll go ahead and also have the forces in Algeria stand down. He de-escalates the war, and then he's basically like, you know what? We'll leave it up to you guys.
Yeah, because like I say, that part was like the way that the colonies basically were able to be set free in this whole thing is they had to ratify the Constitution on their end, and then they were good. Algiers is considered separate because they're considered a full-on part of France. So after this is ratified and the colonies are let go, Algiers is still a part of France. He goes down into Algiers, he neutralizes the French army and is like, you guys got to stand down. I'm trying to do some stuff here. Let's de-escalate this. You wanted me here. I'm here. Let's get this figured out. Well, the way that he ends up figuring it out is the old double cross, because in 1959, he offers Algiers self-determination and basically leaving it up to them whether they want to stay in France or not.
So you're saying the double cross was against Moreso?
Oh, yeah. But at the same time, is it really... We'll get to that. Just remember, this is where the first double cross happens.
And we forgot to mention as well, and I apologize about this, this also leads into what I don't believe is a conspiracy. So the like party that, or government that Moreso had created when he took over the French government there in Algeria, it was actually a De Gaulleist loyalty party. So it was essentially like a party in support for return of De Gaulle. And that's why with the Civil War looming, they were like, if we give them De Gaulle and put him in that position, they have no reason to fight, and he'll take care of that. So basically, these people are fighting for what is perceived to be Algeria staying part of France, but then De Gaulle turns around and he's like, well, actually, we're going to let them decide on it. So you would think that the guy that was leading it, that Moreso guy that had been given the 5 regions of France, would be like, no, fuck this guy. He would come out against De Gaulle, all this stuff. He would quit his position. Yeah, that really didn't end up happening. And just in my head, it kind of leads me to believe that, like, that guy didn't have to have a stake in Algeria.
No.
He could have not given 2 shits about it if he was just like, hey, you know, if you do this, like, I'll just set you up for life here.
Well,
And he's like, back in France, he's like, I don't have to be in Algeria anymore. He's like, no. And he's like, okay, fuck yeah. He's like, I'll go ahead and do a little coup in with you.
and a massive part of that, I think, maybe that allowed him to get out undercover is there's a Pied Noir revolt in 1960, and they fight for another 2 years until 1962, when 900,000 of these Pied Noir ended up having to flee Algiers. So it's almost like there's such a revolt breaking out from the Pied Noir that it kind of maybe gives Moreso cover to get out, and they're not worried about him anymore.
Yeah.
Out of this, and kind of over his lifetime, this guy has a pretty staggering number of assassination attempts that were taken on his life. And a lot of these start coming after what he did in Algiers, because the military that he squashed that tried to take over would then come back and form these little sleeper cell factions to try to knock off De Gaulle for it.
So, kind of going back a little bit, after he's made PM on June 1st, he's then actually elected the president of France under the terms of this new constitution, how it's going to actually have a president. So he had a tough economic policy. Basically, he was just it was almost kind of like he took state possession of certain industries and everything. So it actually seemed a little bit, dare I say, communist in regards to that. He wants nukes, got to have nukes. In fact, France is the 4th nuclear superpower.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, finish that out. That's in a list of stuff that we got to talk about, because I wrote a bunch of them down, and some of them are pretty great, and then some of them are like, this is just De Gaulle being De Gaulle again.
Yeah. De Gaulle starts building Franco-German cooperation. So he basically is like, these guys are our largest neighbor. They already elected and have installed a new government. We fought them enough. Let's go ahead and like figure this thing out so we can all prosper. So that kind of reaching across there was kind of it kind of showed you maybe that like his concern wasn't about it wasn't about beating the Germans. It was just getting the Germans out of France so France could be independent again. And then he was like, you allies can then beat the Germans and everything, or the Nazis.
Where are you doing business in Germany?
Berlin?
Yeah, with the Western powers.
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of like an ipso facto quasi, if I can do business in Berlin and West Berlin, I'm also doing business with England and the United States. But at the same time, they've done, we'll get back to the assassinations in a second because we got to get into this list. So 1960, like you say, France becomes the fourth nuclear power of the world, which is huge. It had to have been U.S., Russia, China, and then
US,
France?
Russia, Great Britain.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay. So they beat China to it. In 1964, the French GDP surpasses the United Kingdom for the first time in nearly 100 years. So they're in a situation where it almost looks like they could try to make the argument that they've recovered better out of World War II by 1964 because their GDP is higher than the United Kingdom.
I think part of what contributed to that is France was kind of kept as pristine as it could. Hitler didn't want to cause any unnecessary destruction until it came to liberating Paris. Then he was like, well, if I lost it, I'm going to fucking wreck it on my way out. But I think he wanted to keep that because he knew he had to, that was going to be his GDP. At that point, it was going to be his resources.
Yeah.
And so they didn't have as much rebuilding to do. They could get up to speed if they had kind of the right plan in place, I guess.
1966, France withdraws from NATO.
Yeah, I didn't see that one coming, but I think this is when he is doing his little petty shit where he's like, you guys didn't invite me to the conferences. I wasn't privy to certain plans and everything. And so I don't want to be part of this little club anymore.
Well, part of his belief in it was it's hard to be self-determined and to make your own choices if you're a part of an organization that's making choices for the betterment of everybody. So, like, you want to go out on your own and strike your own deals. You don't want to just be involved in NATO stuff because that raises all boats. You're just looking to raise France's boat at this point. I want to say this was right around the time that they had the United Kingdom's application into this European Economic Summit declined, that they were already in. It's just like a fuck you back to the United Kingdom. And then the man travels all the way across the ocean in 1967 to Quebec. Did you hear about the Quebec incident?
I heard a little bit about it, but please do tell.
He's up giving a speech in Quebec. I believe he's in the capital. I could say a name, and I'm sure it's not right. Quebec City, maybe, is the capital city of Quebec.
The capital of Quebec.
He calls during this speech for Quebec's independence from Canada. Because they're French.
They are the most French of all the Canadians.
Yes.
Just like British Canadians.
But could you imagine going to a state anywhere in the United States and just being like, hey, say California, say any of the major GDP hubs, Texas, and calling for their independence, and everybody else around them that lives in Texas or that is in Texas and doesn't believe, is like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
We have to live here. You can go home. We have to deal with these people that you're riling up.
Why?
Yeah. Nobody's talking about this here.
We still kind of talk like you guys, but we have a lot more in common with these guys. Like, we're all fucking chill here. Like, you know, we're a little more high strung because we're French naturally, but they make jokes about it. We make jokes about how they say A on everything, and it's cool. We're doing good.
Why would we want to come back and join you guys when we already feel like we're superior to everybody else in Canada?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Let's just let us live here and do this.
We are the France of Canada. Come on.
So he just has these little things where, like, you see the big ups that he's doing. To raise the GDP past the UK is huge. That's a pretty big deal. To obtain nuclear arms, the fourth one in the world to do it, that puts you as a major player on the stage to be like, well, if you guys can do this, I can do it too, and every other country has to bow down to us. To pull out of NATO and make your own choices, trying to say, I think I can do this better than you, is such an arrogant move. And then to go to another country and be like, we want free French here too. Bro, the war's over. Free France is, you're free.
You're just France.
Yep, stop trying to free up everybody else.
France.
Let's just keep it within your borders. And then in 1968, he runs in something. It has many different labels. I labeled it the Students' Revolt because this is kind of where everything starts. Huh?
Result or revolt?
Revolt. What do you got?
Go ahead. No, you.
You got anything for that?
I was just going to say, so kind of one of the things that actually kind of contributed to that is there were certain forms of like independent or free press and everything in France at this time. There were also some like, some radio stations and everything. Again, this was at a time when communication was basically through like TV was kind of a new thing. Radio was still kind of probably the primary way and everything of getting information.
Yeah.
And his government had a monopoly basically kind of on the radio networks and the TV. So even if someone was running against him or trying to, promote different policies or something like that, you were getting saturated with De Gaulle.
This feels like a D word. This feels like a little dictatorish.
Yeah, a little bit. The control of forms of media.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see that being an issue.
Yeah, and I mean, you get to a point where you're getting a younger generation that's coming up. Again, this is in 68. This is the generation that was born to people coming home from World War II and seeing the impact that that could have had on their parents. And is like, we're still kind of sitting under the guy that was associated with that and is kind of running stuff like we imagine it would have been run at that time. We want something different. It's supposed to be better. And so you get, student protests at universities. And it's getting to the point where it's kind of getting whiffs of a potential civil war at this point.
Yeah.
Which it seems like that happened very frequently.
Well, and it happened so fast, and I don't think he really understood it because they quelled protests in ways that weren't always probably the most efficient.
Using the military?
Police.
Well, I was going to say at this point, a lot of the French military was actually because they weren't actively fighting any wars close to home.
Yeah.
I guess you could say a lot of them were used against this.
Well, these far left student protests at these universities were mainly aimed at capitalism, consumerism, which, again, living in a capitalist society, the idea of capitalism is brilliant and it's beautiful. And if it works out perfectly, it should be something that is beneficial to everybody. Unfortunately, the reality of capitalism is there's a separation that it makes in classes kind of without intentionally doing it.
It's its nature, though. Because its nature is based upon human behavior.
Yeah.
And human behavior seems like, unfortunately, it's always going to skew toward greed.
Mm-hmm.
And so instead of even a remotely decent distribution of wealth, you get the exact situations that pretty much every capitalist society gets into. You have a majority of the wealth being held by the top 5%, while the rest of us are just like, okay, I guess that's how it has to work. Yeah, no, what?
Yeah, but to go along with that and the consumerism of society, and all of these protests kind of start to shake France at its core because this is kind of what France loves, is some sort of a revolution. The police repression of these protests actually...
haven't had a good revolution in a while.
Yeah, no shit. It backfires pretty quick because they're repressing these protests, and France's trade unions start to talk about sympathy strikes alongside the students. And at one point in time, they expected over 11 million workers, or 22% of the French population, were going to go on strike. And these trade unions use their leverage to make big gains for workers, these things called the Grenelle Accords. And De Gaulle's like, shit, the students are revolting. Potentially 22% of my population is going to go on strike. I kind of want this to stop, but I can't really do it in a violent way because violence begets violence in France pretty much all the time.
But if I needed to do it in a violent-ish-esque way, who should I go to ensure that I have his support?
Well,
this is the wrap up. Essentially, this is what brings it all around for the conspiracy, is this right here.
Yeah. De Gaulle, I believe, was heading off to, it was like I think
Baden or something
well,
in Germany.
that was where he heads off to, but initially he was supposed to be traveling with his family to like their summer home.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of away from Paris getaway. I forgot what it's called. It's got some cool name. But instead, De Gaulle goes down to Germany where it's being occupied by the French. Balu Balu, I think yeah. And he is so concerned and needs to get down there because he's thinking, if this goes south and there's a civil war, I need some kind of protection, because if everybody flips on me in France, I'm going to need to not die here.
I need to be able to bring in someone that can quell anything and that I know is going to not try to turn on me.
And little did you know, the man that was working down there in Malu Malu in French Baden-Baden. Sorry. It was working down there in the French area was a man named General Moreso. General Moreso, the same guy that sparked what was going on in Algiers, that named his new government down there after De Gaulle.
The guy that people would assume would be so betrayed because Algeria got its independence through self-determination. You would think this guy, when De Gaulle came up to him was like, hey, I'm going to need your support in case there's this like civil revolt and everything like that. I can count on you, right? And Moreso's like, you know what? Fuck you for what you did in Algeria. You would think, right?
Yeah.
Moreso was like, of course. We're boys.
We got you, boss. If you call, we'll show up.
Fuck yes. Why would you support that if it was not just some arrangement of trying to get De Gaulle back into power?
And maybe there's something missing here. Maybe if we have a French historian or a French person who listens that can give us a little bit more understanding. I don't really think we got much of this wrong in this conspiracy. But yeah, I'd like a little more clarity, because I'm leaning more towards this might have been something that was done intentionally. But De Gaulle ends up flying back to Paris knowing that he has the support of the French forces in Germany. He ends up deciding that before these strikes are going to go into place, kind of to quell the fears, he goes back to the old faithful. He doesn't get on TV. He gets on the radio. And
gets on the ones and twos, baby.
He basically takes it back to what he was doing for the BBC to try to rally this support and free France.
Hello. I'm coming at you from AM radio. Everyone's just fucking listening to the fucking Beatles.
Yeah. He speaks fairly concisely. He doesn't use a lot of flowery language. He gets down to kind of brass tacks and gains enough of the people's ear to where they decide that maybe this strike isn't the greatest idea. Maybe France is better off trying to avoid this civil war. And as soon as this happens, there was the older population had heard enough and remembered enough about De Gaulle to be like, all right, maybe we got to calm down on this a little bit. And after that happens, May 30th, 1968, De Gaulle...
Hey, you kids, you'd be speaking German right now if it wasn't for De Gaulle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's probably what they said. CDG... De Gaulle decides to dissolve parliament, which of course pleased the protesters, because that's something that they were protesting against was the government. 1968, because I think the radio address and the way that De Gaulle plays this, the elections ended up going well. He ends up getting reelected.
Crazy. He fucking dissolves parliament. So he's just like, yeah, we're getting rid of this thing.
But that can go two ways. Is everybody still going to be mad enough for you not to gain back enough seats to be able to be put back in charge?
They should fucking be.
Yeah. But he ends up winning 352 of 487 seats.
This is why I think at this point, and I'm not sure exactly who was able to vote at this point in France, but I feel like at this point, having control over most of the radio and a monopoly on TV really helps you get your message out there while also just, shouting over anybody else's message.
There's a chance. I don't think there's anything wrong with that assumption. De Gaulle's a pretty old fella at this point, and he's fought a lot of battles. He's won a lot of battles. He's kind of moved a lot of mountains for France. And he ends up making it all the way until April 28th in 1969. There is a nationwide referendum to try to reform the Senate and local governments that he had put forward. I don't know if that was trying to consolidate power. There's always a chance that it was, especially after learning kind of maybe how he came back into power. But it gets rejected, and as soon as it gets rejected, he decides to resign. He is replaced by, and I just threw this guy's name in because I wanted to say it, Georges Pompidou. Pretty cool name. I don't know if he's good enough to do an episode on, but I'd like to say Pompidou some more. He doesn't get to enjoy retirement for as long as you think he would.
No. And me and you were kind of talking about this, about, kind of reason for resigning and everything. And kind of just based on the last portion of his time, essentially, as king president of France. He just finds that anything that he does is short term. Yeah. He's getting pushback on every single thing he does. And I think it gets to the point where he understands that with the younger generation making this push, it's only going to get worse for him for these changes, and he's not going to have that power anymore. And just even seeing things like his, proposals and that kind of stuff, his reforms get shot down. He was like, I think this is the time where I'm done getting away with what I can get away with. And if I can't do it my way, then I shouldn't do it.
I think there's a lot that can be taken from that. I'd like to think that that's what it is, and I'd like to think that that's what would come to more politicians' minds.
Yeah.
But I don't know if it's going to happen.
No.
November 9th, 1970, De Gaulle is watching TV, sitting in his house. He loved playing bridge. Like, he had a bridge table that he would just sit in front of and play while they watched TV. And at this point in time, him and Yvonne were sitting down watching TV, watching the news, and De Gaulle suffers an aneurysm and would end up dying from it. That's a very sad part of this. One thing that I took from it was like a news report that I was watching that they were doing about France and about De Gaulle. When he died, on his way out, he told his wife that if he dies, she should burn all their things, which feels like a move.
Don't ask questions. There's just...
Yeah, this sounds like the ultimate if I die, erase my search history.
Yeah.
And so after he passes away, like within a night or two, De Gaulle's neighbors look out and they see this big giant fire out in front of the house.
Oh, fuck, she did it?
There were things like she burned their bed and anything else that they shared. And
the documents are in the bed.
I can't be 100% certain, but I'm 99% certain that there was definitely some memoirs or anything, something else that people didn't want to know about that ended up in that fire as well.
In the mattress.
But it's a perfect cover to be like, I loved you so much, I don't want you to spend another night alone in this bed that we shared, so just go ahead and burn it. Like, it's pretty interesting that was the move, was to light everything on fire.
Things burning for a long time, like it's stuffed with something. Mattresses usually go up way faster than this.
November 12th, 1970. The funeral that was held is still currently to this day the biggest funeral in French history. Which, there were more people than, I guess Napoleon probably didn't have a massive... He probably had a big funeral, but I think by the time he went out, there probably wasn't a whole lot of
Probably
not out there. But I think that just kind of lays how big of an impact De Gaulle had. Was he wasn't out of power for long. He had a lot of things that had gone south for him. He ends up quitting, but there was still that big of a turnout for it.
I think people had to... It was still at a time when people could remember essentially what he did. And it was more of a respect of the art, not the artist, a respect of the action that he did, not maybe of the person.
Well, Pompidou, after he finds out that De Gaulle dies, he comes out, and one of the lines that he says is, General De Gaulle is dead and France is a widow.
Yeah.
Like, that's a pretty powerful thing to say, that this guy was France's husband. So I got to think that he still had quite a bit of favor, and it's not like he got voted out. He did quit.
Like, what are you saying if you don't do something like that? Like, of course, it's the biggest funeral. You can't deny that. But with that being the biggest funeral, I mean, with someone that's that pivotal and essentially why your country is still essentially a free country,
Yeah.
you would be politically just murdering yourself to be like, oh yeah, we're not going to have a day to celebrate this guy. There would still be enough people, even people that like don't necessarily liked him, been like, the motherfucker probably deserved a day though, because he did kind of, help us not be speaking German right now.
Yeah. Yep. I do. I heard this one time, so it's tough to go with it, but I have to. Nixon was at his funeral, and Nixon also declared, I think it was a week of mourning back in the United States for De Gaulle. So I don't know if that's it.
1 week we will be mourning Charles Rene Maria Montoya de Gaulle.
I don't know if that was like part of trade negotiations, maybe, to be like, look, we like you guys too. Give us some of your French stuff. Mm-hmm. But this guy, to do as much on World War II as we have, and for him not to pop up, has always seemed so interesting to me now after digging through all this stuff, which always is a couple days. But it's a big story, but it's also not, I think I told you this earlier, De Gaulle's story wasn't of World War II. De Gaulle's story wasn't the Allies versus the Axis. De Gaulle's story was the French versus the Vichy.
Yeah.
And that was the part that he played. And he was an ancillary character in the grand scheme of things, but at the same time, he was so important to be able to rally the resistance to help get us back into France.
Yeah. Yeah, he had me until the coup. Yeah, no, nothing good ever comes of a coup. You never say like, oh, he was such a nice man with that coup.
It wasn't a coochie coup?
No. All right, guys. Well, I hope you enjoyed another long one. You got anything else on this one, buddy?
No, happy we found him.
All right, guys. Well, thanks for joining us on this week's episode. We'll catch you next time.
Peace.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us for another episode. If you like what you heard, hit that subscribe and like button. Follow us. If you didn't like what you heard, still hit that anyway, because we'll probably cover something in the future that you do like. Please follow us on our social media. Adam, hit him with it.
Our Instagram is historically high pod, historically high pod, and we are on Twitter at historically high. That's historically HI.
All right. And if you guys want to send in any feedback, suggestions, hit us up on those two, or you can even do it on Gmail. It's historicallyhighpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again.
Peace.